who inherited the family cattle farm after Dad passed in 2018. 60 acres wasn't much compared to the big operations, but it kept me busy enough, especially during calving season when I needed extra hands. I just turned 31 that spring, still learning the ropes of running the whole operation solo, juggling the books and the actual farming, when I put out word at the feed store that I needed temporary help. Most locals already had their own work, so I wasn't surprised when the only person who showed up was someone nobody recognized, a man who said he'd been working farms down in Kansas and was heading north for the summer. His name was Carl Brennan, and right away I noticed how he barely made eye contact when we talked. Not in a shifty way, more like he was just deeply uncomfortable with people, which honestly wasn't that unusual for farm hands passing through. He had rough, calloused hands that told me he knew work, and when I showed him around the property that first day in early May, he seemed most interested in the back 40 acres where we had a large pond surrounded by thick woods. The cattle rarely went back there since we had water tanks closer to the barn, so I mentioned it was pretty much just wildlife habitat, maybe needed some fence maintenance along the tree line. Carl just nodded, said he could handle whatever needed doing, and asked if he could park his old camper van near the equipment shed. For the first couple weeks, Carl was exactly what I needed. He showed up before sunrise, worked steady through the heat of the day, and never complained about anything I asked him to do. He fixed fences faster than any hired help I'd had before, had a good sense for handling the cattle without spooking them, and even repaired some equipment I'd been meaning to get to for months. But I started noticing he spent every lunch break walking back toward that pond area, always carrying a small backpack, always alone. When I asked if he was fishing back there, he just shrugged and said he liked the quiet, needed to clear his head away from the noise of the farm equipment. By the third week, I began seeing things that made me uneasy, though I kept telling myself I was being paranoid about a good worker. Carl would come back from his lunch breaks with fresh scratches on his arms, and sometimes his face, deep ones that looked like they'd come from thorns or branches. When I mentioned he should be careful in those woods, maybe wear longer sleeves, he got this strange look and said he knew what he was doing, that he'd been dealing with wild areas his whole life. He started getting territorial about that section of the property too, always volunteering to check the fence lines back there before I even asked, always insisting he could handle any maintenance around the pond by himself. One afternoon in late May, my neighbor Tom stopped by to return a tool he'd borrowed, and we got to talking by the barn. Carl was working on a tractor nearby, but when Tom mentioned how his daughter and her friend had gone missing from a town about 40 miles south last month, I saw Carl's whole body go rigid. He dropped the wrench he was holding, and when it clanged on the concrete, he flinched like someone had fired a gun. Tom didn't notice, kept talking about how the girl's car was found abandoned on a rural road. No sign of them anywhere, but I watched Carl gather his tools and walk quickly toward his van without saying a word. That night, I heard his van engine start around midnight, saw the headlights sweep across my bedroom window as he drove off, but the next morning he was back working like nothing had happened. I started paying closer attention after that, maybe checking on him more than I should have. Found out he always paid for everything in cash at the feed store, never used the local diner where most farm workers grabbed breakfast, and nobody had seen him anywhere in town except for buying supplies. When I casually asked where in Kansas he'd worked before, he got defensive, said it was a small operation near the Oklahoma border, nobody I'd know, and changed the subject immediately. He'd been with me about a month when I decided to walk back to the pond myself one evening after he'd left, just to see what he was doing back there during all those lunch breaks. The path through the woods was more worn than I remembered, like someone had been walking it daily for weeks, which made sense given Carl's routine. But when I got closer to the pond, I noticed other things that didn't make sense at all. There were areas where the underbrush had been cleared away, not in a random pattern, but in specific spots around the water's edge. Fresh tool marks on some trees, like someone had been digging and needed to lean a shovel against them. The ground in 3 or 4 places looked different, recently disturbed but already starting to grow back with spring grass. I told myself he'd probably been burying trash or maybe dealing with some dead animals he'd found. But something about the size and shape of those patches made my chest tighten. The next morning, Carl could tell something was different. He kept watching me while he worked, and when lunchtime came, he didn't head back to the pond like usual. Instead, he sat in his van, windows down, just staring toward the woods like he was guarding them. I tried to act normal, talked about the weather and upcoming cattle auction, but there was this tension between us now, thick as the humid air before a storm. That Friday, he told me his mother was sick down in Arkansas, said he needed to leave for the weekend but would be back Monday morning. He seemed nervous when he said it, kept rubbing his hands on his jeans, and I noticed dirt under his fingernails, the kind that gets deep under there when you've been digging without gloves. Saturday morning his van was gone like he'd said it would be, but something kept gnawing at me about those disturbed patches by the pond. I tried to focus on my usual weekend work, but by noon I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a spade from the tool shed and walked back there, my heart hammering harder with each step through those woods. The first patch I tried was near a big oak tree, and about 2 feet down, my spade hit something that wasn't root or rock. I cleared more dirt away with my hands, and that's when I saw it. A piece of fabric looked like part of a jacket, pink or maybe coral-colored. My mouth went completely dry and I stood there for maybe 5 minutes just staring at that scrap of material before I walked back to the house and called the sheriff. They brought in a whole team that afternoon, deputies and state police and people with equipment I'd never seen before. By Sunday evening, they'd found 2 bodies, both young women, both in shallow graves near the pond's edge. One had been there maybe 6 weeks, the other probably 3, according to what I overheard the investigators saying. The pink fabric I'd found belonged to a University of Iowa student who disappeared from a rest stop 50 miles away. The other woman was a waitress from a truck stop near the Missouri border, last seen walking to her car after a night shift. Both of them had been reported missing. Their pictures in newspapers I'd never thought to connect to my quiet farmhand who kept to himself and worked hard. Carl never came back Monday morning, never came back at all. They found his van abandoned at a rest area in South Dakota 3 days later, wiped clean of prints but with blood evidence in the back that matched both victims. Turns out Carl Brennan wasn't even his real name. He was actually Robert Hutchinson, wanted for questioning in similar disappearances across 4 states over the past 2 years. The FBI agent who interviewed me said he'd probably been using farms like mine all along, places with woods and water, isolated enough that nobody would notice fresh digging, owners too busy with daily work to pay attention to remote corners of their property. They figured he kept moving whenever he sensed someone getting suspicious, just drifting from one farm job to another, state to state, leaving bodies buried in places that might never be found if not for dumb luck or an observant owner. They never caught him, far as I know. Sometimes I check online, looking for news about Robert Hutchinson or similar cases, but there's nothing. The FBI said he probably changed his appearance, got new fake documents, might even be working another farm somewhere right now. I had to drain that pond later that year, couldn't stand looking at it, and I sold the back 40 acres to my neighbor Tom, who turned it into pasture. But even now, 5 years later, whenever someone comes looking for farm work, especially if they're traveling through and seem eager to work alone, I tell them I'm fully staffed. I learned the hard way that sometimes the real monsters are just quiet men with dirt under their fingernails, and the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly where to hide their kills. Moving into Grandma Rose's farmhouse felt like stepping into a time capsule from 1973, complete with harvest gold appliances and that peculiar smell of old wood mixed with decades of Sunday dinners. I'd just turned 31 that March, and after the reading of her will, I suddenly owned 40 acres of Indiana farmland with a 2-story house that hadn't seen a proper update since disco was king. My sister wanted nothing to do with it, said the isolation would drive her crazy, but after years of cramped city apartments and neighbors who practiced drums at midnight, the solitude seemed like exactly what I needed. The nearest neighbor lived about 3 miles down the gravel road, and honestly, that suited me just fine. I spent the first 2 weeks hauling donation boxes, scrubbing floors, and discovering all the quirks of a house that had settled into its bones over 50 years. Everything changed on my 3rd Thursday there, when I heard the first knock while washing dishes after dinner. Just a soft tap 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 on the back porch door, barely audible over the running water. I dried my hands and went to check, but the motion sensor light showed nothing except the empty wooden deck and the field stretching out toward the old barn about 200 feet away. Figured it was just a branch or maybe a raccoon investigating the new human in residence. But then it happened again the next night, this time at the kitchen window while I was making tea. Same rhythm, same gentle persistence, except windows don't get knocked on by falling branches. I pulled back the curtain fast, trying to catch whatever it was, but again saw only darkness and my own reflection staring back. By the fourth night, when the knocking moved to the cellar door inside the mudroom, I'd stopped trying to explain it away as wildlife. Saturday morning brought the first real sign that something was seriously wrong. I came downstairs to make coffee and noticed the basement door handle was covered in dried mud, thick globs of it caked into the grooves like someone had grabbed it repeatedly with filthy hands. The door was still locked, thank God, but seeing that dirt made my chest tighten in a way those knocks hadn't. I grabbed paper towels and cleaned it off, telling myself maybe I'd done it myself while gardening and forgotten, even though I hadn't been near the basement in days. The handle was old brass, worn smooth by decades of use, and the mud had dried into every tiny scratch and dent. What really got me was how the dirt pattern showed multiple grip attempts, overlapping prints like someone had stood there for a while, trying again and again. I spent that whole day checking every lock twice, moving through the house with this nervous energy I couldn't shake. The farmhouse had too many entrance points, I realized, counting them like a paranoid inventory. Front door, back porch door, mudroom side entrance, cellar door from inside, plus the external bulkhead doors that led straight to the basement from outside, though those had been padlocked shut since I arrived. 9 windows on the ground floor alone, most with those old-style latches that barely held. The barn had its own problems. A side door that wouldn't close properly, and windows so old the glass had that wavy quality that distorted everything you saw through them. As darkness fell that Saturday, I found myself pulling all the curtains closed, something I'd never done before, preferring to wake with natural light. But natural light seemed less important than not feeling like I was living in a fishbowl. That night, around 2 in the morning, the gravel driveway woke me up. You learn the sounds of a place pretty quick when you're alone, and that crunching rhythm of footsteps on loose stones was unmistakable. Not an animal. Animals don't walk with that steady, deliberate pace. I crept to my bedroom window and peered through a gap in the curtains, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The moon was bright enough to see the driveway clearly, and there was someone down there, just a dark shape moving between the house and the barn. They weren't hurrying, weren't trying to hide, just walking back and forth like they were measuring something or checking distances. The figure stopped near the barn side entrance, stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then walked toward the house, disappearing from my line of sight as they moved under the window. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but the battery was at 12% because I'd forgotten to charge it, and of course Grandma Rose never had a landline installed. The nearest police station was in town, 25 minutes away on a good day. I stood there in my pajamas, listening to those footsteps circle the house, stopping at what sounded like each door, each window. They were testing things, I realized with this sick feeling spreading through my gut. Learning which boards creaked, which gravel patches were loudest, mapping out the property like they were planning something. After what felt like hours, but was probably 10 minutes, the footsteps moved back toward the barn. Then came the sound that made me grab the baseball bat from under my bed. The sharp crack of breaking glass, clear and deliberate, from the barn side window. Not an accident, not thrown rock, but something purposeful that sent shards tinkling onto the ground. The house went silent except for my own breathing, but I knew they hadn't left. They were in the barn now, doing God knows what, and I was trapped between calling 911 with my dying phone or saving the battery in case things got worse. I chose to wait, clutching that bat like it could actually protect me from someone bold enough to break into property while I was clearly home. Through the thin farmhouse walls, I heard them exit the barn and start their methodical check of the house's entrances. First the front door, a slow turn of the handle, testing, then footsteps on the wraparound porch, boards groaning under their weight. The back door handle jiggled next, longer this time, more insistent. They knew exactly which doors I'd checked earlier, which ones might have been forgotten. The mudroom door got the same treatment, then silence for a moment before I heard them at the bulkhead doors, the metallic rattle of the padlock being tugged. My phone showed 9% battery when I finally dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about the intruder. She kept asking me to speak up, but I could hear them moving along the house's foundation, probably checking the ground floor windows now. The dispatcher said a unit was on the way, but we both knew what 25 minutes meant out here. She stayed on the line, my phone dropping to 6%, then 5%, her voice cutting in and out as the connection struggled. Then I heard what I'd been dreading, the subtle scrape of a window being pushed up. Not forced, not broken, just sliding open like they knew exactly which one had a broken latch. The dispatcher was saying something about locking myself in the bathroom, but my phone screen went black, battery dead. I heard feet hit the floor downstairs, careful but not silent, and the sound of someone moving through my grandmother's kitchen like they'd been there before. The old farmhouse betrayed every movement with creaks and groans, so I knew they were heading for the stairs. I had maybe 30 seconds to decide, hide, run, or fight. The bat in my hands felt like a toy against someone this prepared, someone who'd spent nights learning my routine, watching me pull those curtains closed. I crept to my bedroom door and turned the lock, this pathetic little button lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined. Through the heating vent, I could hear them downstairs, opening drawers in the kitchen, not ransacking but searching for something specific. Then their footsteps moved to the living room, paused at what must have been the family photos on the mantel, and headed for the staircase. The first step groaned under their weight, then the second, each sound getting closer while I stood there trying to think of literally any option that didn't end badly. I made my choice when they reached the landing. Grabbed my car keys from the dresser, slipped out of my bedroom as quietly as I could manage, and headed for the back stairs that led straight to the mudroom. These stairs were narrower, servants' stairs from when the house was built, and I knew them better than the intruder could. My bare feet made almost no sound on the old wood, though my breathing seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. I reached the mudroom just as I heard them trying my bedroom door upstairs, the handle turning once, twice, then a sharp shoulder slam against the wood. The mudroom door was locked from earlier, but I had the key on my ring. My fingers fumbled with it while crashes came from upstairs, the sound of my bedroom door finally giving way. Got the door open and ran for my car, gravel cutting into my feet, not caring about the pain, just needing to reach the driver's door before they realized I'd escaped. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God, and I reversed hard down the driveway, not bothering with headlights until I hit the main road. In the rearview mirror, I saw a flashlight beam sweep across the mudroom door, then disappear. I drove straight to the police station in town, walked in barefoot and probably looking insane, and told them everything. 2 officers followed me back, but by then the house was empty, just my broken bedroom door and muddy footprints through the kitchen as proof I wasn't imagining things. They found where someone had been camping in the barn's loft, maybe for weeks, with a sleeping bag, empty food cans, and a notebook filled with observations about the house, my routine, which lights I turned on at what times. The officer showed me one page that made me pack up and leave that same day. A detailed drawing of the house's floor plan, every door and window marked, with notes about which ones were usually locked and which weren't, dated starting 3 days before I'd even moved in. Never did find out who it was, though the police suspected someone who'd been watching the obituaries, knowing the house would be empty after Grandma Rose died. They probably didn't expect anyone to move in so quickly, had already settled into the barn when I arrived, then decided to wait me out or scare me off rather than find somewhere else. I sold the farmhouse 6 months later to a developer who turned it into 3 rental properties, and I made sure to do the closing remotely. Sometimes I still dream about those footsteps on gravel, that methodical testing of doors, the sound of someone moving through a house like they belonged there more than I did. But mostly I'm just grateful for my tiny apartment with its chain lock, deadbolt, and neighbors close enough to hear me scream. Sometimes life throws you into situations that change everything you thought you knew about reading people. During the summer of 2022, I was barely keeping my head above water financially, juggling 2 part-time jobs at a warehouse and a gas station just to make rent on my studio apartment outside Minneapolis. My cousin Kevin mentioned his neighbor needed someone to watch over a farm while recovering from hip surgery, and the pay was decent enough that I could quit both jobs and still come out ahead. Meeting Harold Garrison that first time, he struck me as your typical Minnesota farmer. Weathered hands, soft-spoken, the kind of guy who probably had coffee with the same group of buddies every morning for the past 40 years. His property stretched about 60 acres of corn and soybeans, with a modest farmhouse, 2 barns, and a chicken coop that had seen better days. The arrangement seemed perfect for someone like me who needed steady work and didn't mind the isolation. Harold walked me through everything despite moving slowly with his walker, pointing out where he kept the feed for the chickens and goats, showing me the irrigation controls, explaining which gates needed checking every evening. He had this gentle way of talking, never raising his voice even when the rooster tried attacking my legs during the tour. The daily routine he laid out was straightforward: morning feeding, checking water lines, making sure equipment stayed locked in the main barn, and doing a perimeter check before dark. He handed me a flip phone for emergencies and told me to call if anything seemed unusual, though he assured me nothing ever happened out there except the occasional deer getting into the corn. I moved into the small guest room above the garage that same week, grateful for the chance to save money and work somewhere peaceful for once. For 3 months, everything ran like clockwork. Harold had his surgery in early September and went to stay with his daughter in Wisconsin for recovery, leaving me to handle the farm solo. The work became meditative in a way I hadn't expected, waking up at sunrise to feed the animals, walking the irrigation lines while morning mist hung over the fields, spending evenings repairing fence posts or organizing tools in the barn. Neighbors would wave when driving past, but mostly kept to themselves, and the only regular visitor was a feed delivery guy named Dale, who came every 2 weeks and always had some local gossip to share. Harold called every Sunday to check in, his voice getting stronger each week, asking about the animals and reminding me to oil the tractor even though I'd already done it twice. I started feeling genuinely proud of keeping everything running smoothly, even managed to fix the automatic water system for the goats when it broke, without having to call anyone for help. That Tuesday in November started like any other, until I noticed the black SUVs parked at the end of the driveway around 10 in the morning. 4 vehicles total, all with tinted windows, and I could see people in dark clothing standing near them talking into radios. My first thought was maybe Harold had passed away, and his family sent lawyers or something, but when they started walking up the driveway in formation, I knew this was something else entirely. The woman in front held up a badge before I could even ask what was happening. FBI, she said, and they had a warrant to search the property as part of an ongoing investigation. My mouth went completely dry as she handed me the paperwork, which had Harold's name and address but was filled with legal language I couldn't process in the moment. They told me to stay by the house while they conducted their search, and one agent remained with me, politely declining to answer any of my questions about what they were looking for or why they were there. I watched from the kitchen window as teams spread across the property with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar equipment, focusing most of their attention on the northwest corner, where Harold kept an old equipment shed I'd never needed to enter. The agent staying with me, a younger guy who introduced himself as Agent Nowak, seemed sympathetic to my confusion, and eventually mentioned they were investigating connections to interstate drug trafficking from several years back. He asked how long I'd been working there, if Harold had any regular visitors, whether I'd noticed anything unusual about the property or found anything strange while doing maintenance. All I could tell him was what I knew. Harold seemed like a quiet old farmer who mostly talked about corn prices and his bad hip, and the only things I'd found were rusty tools and mice nests in the barns. By noon, they'd set up a tent near the old shed and brought in excavation equipment, which made my chest tighten, in a way I couldn't quite explain. The digging went on for hours, methodical and precise, while I tried to go about normal tasks to keep myself from staring at them constantly. Around 4 in the afternoon, Agent Nowak's radio crackled and his whole demeanor shifted as he listened to whatever was being said. He told me to stay put and jogged over to where the others had gathered around a hole they'd dug about 6 feet deep. I could see them photographing something, placing evidence markers and making phone calls with serious expressions that made my stomach churn. After what felt like forever, the lead agent came back and informed me they'd discovered a buried 55-gallon drum containing what appeared to be firearms, packaging materials consistent with drug trafficking, and personal effects that might belong to a missing person from 2016. She said they'd need me to come to their field office the next day to give a formal statement, and that I should find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. That night at Kevin's house, I couldn't stop scrolling through news articles on my phone, searching Harold's name along with terms like drug trafficking and organized crime. What I found made me feel like I'd been living in some kind of alternate reality for the past 3 months. Harold Garrison wasn't just some retired farmer. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, he'd been connected to a major trafficking network that moved methamphetamines through the rural Midwest, using farms and agricultural businesses as cover for distribution. The articles mentioned he'd testified in a federal case in 2008 that sent several people to prison, including a man named Vincent Russo, who was believed to control much of the drug trade across 3 states. There were grainy newspaper photos of a younger Harold in a suit outside a courthouse, looking nothing like the gentle old man who'd shown me how to check if eggs were fertilized. The missing person the agents mentioned turned out to be Anthony Cullen, one of Russo's former associates who disappeared right after Harold's testimony, and who many believed had been planning to retaliate against witnesses. The next morning at the FBI field office, I spent 4 hours going through every detail of my time at the farm, with 2 agents who recorded everything and had me sign multiple statements. They showed me photos of people, asking if I'd seen any of them around the property, pictures of vehicles they wanted to know if I recognized, even screenshots of social media profiles to see if Harold had mentioned any of these names. One photo stopped me cold. A man with distinctive scarring on his neck who I remembered seeing at a gas station near the farm about a month earlier. Someone who'd made small talk about the weather, but seemed to be watching me more than was normal. The agents exchanged looks when I mentioned this, making notes and asking for every detail I could remember about the encounter. They explained that several of Russo's old crew had been released from prison in recent years and were persons of interest in ongoing investigations, though they couldn't tell me if I was in any danger or if Harold had known about the barrel buried on his property. What really got to me was when they pulled up a map showing all the properties Harold had owned or managed over the years. 12 different farms spread across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Most sold off in the early 2000s, right before his testimony. The agents theorized that these properties might have been used as waypoints in the trafficking network, places to store product or money temporarily while moving it across state lines. They asked if Harold had ever mentioned other properties, if he'd given me keys or access codes to anywhere else, if there were areas of the farm he'd specifically told me to avoid. The truth was, he'd been nothing but straightforward about everything. Even gave me a detailed map he'd drawn by hand of all the irrigation lines and gates. But now I wondered about that shed in the northwest corner, how he'd casually mentioned it was just full of old equipment from his father's time and not worth messing with, how the lock on it was newer than any other lock on the property. I tried calling Harold after leaving the FBI office, but his phone went straight to voicemail, and his daughter Gloria called me an hour later, sounding shaken and angry. She said federal agents had shown up at her house that morning with questions, that Harold had suffered what they were calling a stress-induced cardiac episode and was in the hospital, that their family lawyer had advised them not to speak with anyone about the situation. She wanted to know what I'd told them, if I'd known anything about her father's past, why I hadn't warned them something like this might happen. I tried explaining that I was just as blindsided as anyone, that her father had only ever been kind to me, but she hung up before I could finish. The next few days were a blur of news vans showing up at Kevin's house. Once word got out about my connection to the farm, reporters calling my phone until I had to turn it off, and the surreal experience of seeing Harold's farm on the evening news with yellow tape around the excavation site. A week later, Agent Nowak called with an update that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. The forensics team had determined that the barrel had been buried sometime in late 2016, several months after Harold's testimony had concluded, and Anthony Cullen had disappeared. The personal items inside, a wallet, a class ring from a Wyoming high school, a distinctive watch, had been confirmed as belonging to Cullen through DNA evidence from his family. The weapons matched those used in several unsolved crimes across state lines, and the packaging materials had residue from methamphetamines, matching the chemical signature of Russo's old operation. Most disturbing was that soil analysis showed the barrel had been moved at least once before being buried at Harold's farm, suggesting someone had deliberately placed it there either to frame Harold or hide evidence where they thought no one would look. Harold himself was still in the hospital, and through his lawyer maintained he had no knowledge of the barrel, but the investigation had expanded to include several other former witnesses from the 2008 trial who might have been similarly targeted. The FBI cleared me of any involvement after 2 more weeks of investigation, but the damage to my life was already done. Every job application I submitted seemed to dead end once employers Googled my name and found articles about the farmhand who uncovered mob burial site, or caretaker's shocking discovery on Minnesota farm. Harold passed away in his sleep 3 weeks after that initial raid, never having left the hospital, never able to explain his side of the story, or whether he'd suspected something might be hidden on his property. Gloria sent me a brief text saying the farm would be sold to cover legal fees, and that my final paycheck would be mailed. I ended up moving to stay with my sister in Colorado, starting over with a warehouse job where nobody knew about my connection to the case. Sometimes I think about that morning feeding the chickens, having no idea that federal agents were already positioned at the end of the driveway, that I was standing above evidence of a murder while scattering corn feed, that Harold might have hired me specifically to have an innocent witness on the property in case this day ever came. The not knowing is what keeps me up at night, whether I was just incredibly unlucky, or whether Harold chose me precisely because I was naive enough to never question the gentle old farmer with the bad hip who just needed someone to tend his animals. People say isolation changes you, and after inheriting my uncle's farm out in northern Montana, I was starting to understand what they meant. It was early October when I first noticed something wasn't right, about 6 months after I'd moved out there to escape the mess of my life in Phoenix. The property stretched for nearly 200 acres, mostly wheat fields and pasture land, with the nearest neighbor being old Frank Gibbs, who lived 8 miles down the gravel road. I'd been fixing up the place slowly, learning to work the land, finding peace in the endless quiet that wrapped around the farmhouse like a heavy blanket. My German shepherd Duke had taken to the country life better than I had, spending his days chasing rabbits and barking at the occasional deer that wandered too close to the vegetable garden I was trying to keep alive. That particular Monday started like any other, with me heading out to the barn around dawn to check on the equipment I'd been restoring. Duke was already outside, sniffing around the chicken coop when I noticed his hackles rise, his nose pressed against the dirt near the barn's side entrance. Fresh boot prints marked the damp ground, definitely not mine since I always wore the same worn work boots, and these had a different tread pattern, deeper and wider. Someone had been here during the night, walking along the barn's perimeter, stopping at each window to peer inside based on how the prints clustered. My first thought was maybe Frank had come by looking for me, but he always honked his horn at the gate, never just showed up unannounced, especially not in the middle of the night. Over the next few days, more signs appeared that made my gut tighten with unease. The grain shed's padlock, which I always clicked shut out of habit from my uncle's warnings about raccoons, hung open on Wednesday morning. The hasp twisted slightly like someone had used a crowbar on it. My toolbox in the barn had been rifled through, wrenches and screwdrivers arranged differently than how I'd left them, with my good hammer missing entirely. Duke started acting strange too, growling at empty air in the middle of the night, pacing the porch with his ears pinned back, refusing to venture past the yard's edge after sunset. I'd convinced myself it was probably just some drifter passing through, maybe looking for easy pickings or a place to sleep. Nothing more sinister than that. Friday brought the storm, one of those sudden October monsters that rolls down from Canada without warning. turning the sky black by 4 in the afternoon. Rain hammered the metal roof so hard it sounded like gunfire, and the wind bent the old cottonwoods nearly horizontal, their branches scraping against the house like fingernails on wood. I was in the kitchen making dinner, just beans and cornbread since I hadn't made it to town for groceries that week, when Duke started that low, threatening growl he reserved for real danger. He stood facing the living room window, every muscle in his body coiled tight, lips pulled back to show his teeth. Through the rain-blurred glass I could barely make out the yard, but then I heard it clearly, the unmistakable sound of someone testing the front door handle, a slow, careful turn followed by pressure against the frame. The handle jiggled again, harder this time, and then stopped. Duke's growl deepened as footsteps moved along the porch, heavy boots that didn't care about being quiet anymore, pausing at each window. I grabbed the shotgun from above the refrigerator, checking that both barrels were loaded with the buckshot I kept for coyotes, then killed the kitchen lights. In the darkness, I could track the intruder's movement by sound alone, boots on wood, then the squeak of someone pressing their face against glass trying to see inside. They went around to the side door near the mudroom, rattling that handle too, then to the back door off the kitchen where I stood holding my breath. The knob turned slowly, once, twice, and I could hear breathing on the other side, wet and labored like whoever it was had been running or was excited about something. Duke launched himself at the back door, barking with a fury that made the walls shake, and the footsteps retreated fast, running now toward the barn. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and went to the window, catching a glimpse of a figure in a long, dark coat disappearing into the barn's main entrance, the one I never locked, because the latch had been broken for years. My rational mind said to stay put, wait it out, let whoever it was take what they wanted and leave. But then I heard the crash of breaking glass from the barn, followed by what sounded like feed bags being thrown around. This wasn't just theft anymore. Someone was destroying my property, maybe looking for something specific or just trying to draw me out there. The smart thing would have been to barricade myself in the house, but I'd put too much work into that barn. Too much of my uncle's legacy was stored in there, and anger started mixing with the fear in my chest. I pulled on my rain jacket and headed for the back door, Duke right beside me, his fur already soaked from his earlier barking fit at the door. The second we stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked me sideways, rain hitting my face like cold needles, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We made it halfway to the barn when I saw the broken window on the side, glass shattered inward just like the premise said, and there was blood on the jagged edges, dark and fresh, dripping onto the hay scattered below. Whoever broke in had cut themselves badly, maybe on their hand or arm, and I could see the blood trail leading deeper into the barn. Duke went rigid beside me, a whine escaping his throat, and that's when I noticed the silence. No more crashing, no more movement from inside, just the storm and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I pushed through the barn door, shotgun raised, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal absolute chaos. Feed sacks were slashed open, grain spilling across the floor in golden puddles, tools pulled from their hooks and scattered like someone had been searching frantically for something. The blood trail led toward the back where I kept the old farming equipment, and as I followed it I could hear something else now, a rhythmic thumping coming from outside, from the direction of the storm cellar. The cellar door was around the back of the barn, one of those angled metal doors that led down to the old root storage my uncle had built decades ago, and the sound was definitely someone working on it, trying to pry it open with something heavy. I'd welded that door shut myself just last month after finding a family of possums living down there, so whoever was out there was wasting their time. But the determination in those steady blows made my skin prickle with a different kind of fear. Duke suddenly bolted toward the barn's rear exit, and I followed, rounding the corner to see a man in that long, dark coat hunched over the cellar door, using my missing hammer to beat on the welded locks. His left hand was wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, blood seeping through, and when my flashlight hit him, he spun around fast, revealing a face I recognized but couldn't quite place. Gaunt features, wild gray hair plastered to his skull by the rain, eyes that had that hollow look of someone who'd been living rough for too long. He dropped the hammer and took a step back, raising his good hand like he was surrendering. but his eyes kept darting between me and that cellar door like it held something precious. Then it clicked. This was Walter Briggs, Frank's younger brother who disappeared about 3 years back after his wife died. Everyone assumed he'd left the state to start fresh somewhere else. "Walter, what the hell are you doing here?" I kept the shotgun pointed at his chest, trying to make sense of why he'd been stalking my property, why he was so desperate to get into that cellar. He opened his mouth, closed it, then started laughing, this broken sound that competed with the storm's fury. "Your uncle, he promised me," Walter said, his voice hoarse like he hadn't used it in months. "Said if anything happened to him I could have what's down there. Said he'd leave a note, instructions. But there was nothing. Nothing in the will, nothing in the house." His injured hand gestured wildly at the cellar door. "I know it's there. I helped him hide it back in '89, 200 grand in cash from that development deal that went bad. Money nobody knew about. Money that should have been mine too since I introduced him to those investors." The pieces started falling into place. My uncle's sudden ability to buy new equipment despite claiming poverty, his paranoid behavior in his final years, always checking locks, installing security lights that I'd thought were excessive for a remote farm. Walter took another step back, stumbling slightly, and I could see he was in bad shape. Probably hadn't eaten properly in days, that hand needing medical attention before infection set in. "I've been living in the old Mitchell place," he said, naming an abandoned farmhouse about 10 miles north that had been empty since I was a kid. "Been watching, waiting for you to leave for supplies. But you never stay away long enough for me to break through that weld. Tonight, with the storm, I thought maybe you wouldn't hear me working on it." Duke kept growling, staying between Walter and me, and I had to make a decision fast because this situation could go bad quickly with a desperate, injured man who'd been living on the edge for years. "Walter, there's no money down there," I said, though honestly I had no idea what my uncle might have hidden. "I cleaned it out when I moved in. Just old canning jars and rusted tools, nothing worth risking your life over." His face crumpled like I'd just told him his family had died all over again, and he sank to his knees in the mud, that injured hand cradled against his chest. I lowered the shotgun slightly, seeing him broken like that in the rain, and made a choice that probably saved both our lives that night. "Come inside, let me look at that hand," I said, surprising myself with the offer. "We'll call Frank, get you somewhere warm and dry, get you some help." Walter looked up at me with those hollow eyes, then nodded slowly, all the fight drained out of him. We walked back to the house together, Duke keeping a watchful eye on our unexpected guest, and I bandaged his hand while coffee brewed, the storm still raging outside. Frank arrived 2 hours later in his truck, having fought through flooded roads to get there, and the brothers had a conversation I pretended not to hear, lots of tears and apologies and promises to get help. Before they left, Walter told me exactly where my uncle had put the money, behind a false wall in the cellar's northeast corner. Said I'd earned it by showing him kindness when I could have done much worse. After they drove away, I sat in my kitchen until dawn, thinking about that money supposedly hidden beneath my feet, about secrets and promises, and what desperation could drive a person to do. When the sun finally came up, I walked out to the barn with Duke, grabbed a sledgehammer and went to work on that cellar door. Not sure what I'd find, but knowing I needed to see for myself what had driven Walter to the edge of sanity. The cellar was exactly as I'd left it before welding it shut, musty and filled with broken shelving, except for the northeast corner Walter had described. Behind what looked like solid stone, I found a narrow gap, and inside that gap, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, was more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Not quite 200 grand anymore. Time and moisture had damaged some bills despite the wrapping, but enough to change everything if I wanted it to. I stood there for a long time, holding those bundles of cash that had cost Walter his sanity, and my uncle his peace of mind, understanding finally why the old man had become so paranoid near the end. That afternoon, I drove to Frank's place where Walter was resting, handed him half the money in a duffel bag, and told him my uncle would have wanted him to have it, which might have been true or might have been my way of buying back my own peace of mind. Walter ended up checking into a treatment facility in Billings, got himself sorted out, and last I heard he was living with his daughter in Oregon, working at her hardware store, trying to make up for the lost years. I used my half to fix up the farm properly, installed a real security system, and adopted 2 more dogs from the shelter because Duke deserved some backup after that night. Sometimes I still hear sounds outside during storms, but now it's just the wind or animals seeking shelter. Nothing more sinister than nature doing what nature does, and I sleep better knowing that some secrets are better shared than buried, even if it takes a desperate night and a bloody hand to bring them to light. When I bought the Hutchins property in February 2023, everyone in town told me I got a steal. The old man had died alone in January, no kids, distant relatives who just wanted it gone. 39 acres of decent farmland in central Pennsylvania for less than most people pay for a starter home. I'd been saving since my late 20s, working construction in Philadelphia, dreaming of having my own place where I could fix things with my hands and not answer to anyone. The house needed work but had good bones. The workshop out back, though, that's where things got complicated. It was a separate building about 50 yards from the main house. Metal siding painted barn red, windows so caked with grime you couldn't see inside. The real estate agent said the old man used it for storage, hadn't been opened in years. I figured I'd clean it out, turn it into a proper workspace for woodworking, maybe build furniture to sell at the farmer's market in town. The first time I stepped inside that workshop, the smell hit me like a physical thing. Not decay exactly, more like decades of stale air, motor oil, and something else I couldn't place. Mustiness mixed with old leather and dust so thick it coated my teeth. There were tools everywhere, most of them rusted, hanging on pegboards or scattered across a workbench that ran the length of the back wall. Boxes of old tractor parts, coils of wire, mason jars filled with nails and screws. Pretty standard stuff for a farm workshop. The concrete floor was cracked in places, stained dark with what I assumed was oil or transmission fluid. I spent the first few days just hauling junk out, filling the bed of my truck over and over, making runs to the county dump. My nearest neighbor, an older guy named Eugene who ran cattle on the property next door, would wave from his tractor when he saw me working. He'd known the previous owner, said he'd been a quiet man, kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. That's how people described everyone out here, it seemed. Quiet, kept to themselves. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, maybe 2 weeks into clearing out the workshop, when I noticed the floor wasn't level. Not in an old building settling kind of way, but deliberately uneven. There was a section near the back corner, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, where the concrete sat slightly higher than the rest, like someone had poured a patch job years ago and hadn't bothered to smooth it out properly. When I swept the area clean, I could see the seam where new concrete met old. The color was different too, lighter gray, not as weathered. I grabbed a pry bar from my truck and started chipping at the edge, curious more than anything. The concrete was only a couple inches thick, not the proper 4 or 5 you'd expect. Underneath wasn't gravel or dirt. It was wood. Plywood specifically, cut to fit the space and laid flat. My brain started working through possibilities. Maybe an old root cellar, or a spot where the original floor had rotted through. But why cover it with such a thin layer of concrete? Why not fix it properly? I pulled up the plywood sheets. They came away easily, practically fell apart in my hands from moisture damage. The smell that came up from below made me gag and step back, one hand covering my mouth and nose. It wasn't death, nothing like the dead raccoon I'd found in the house chimney. This was earthier, damper, like opening a grave that had been sealed for decades. The hole below was maybe 4 feet deep, barely enough to qualify as a crawl space. The walls raw dirt held back by old 2x4s. It was dark down there, even with the afternoon sun coming through the workshop windows. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, leaned over the edge to look down. At first, I just saw dirt and more wood, some kind of shelf or platform built into the space. Then I saw the box. It was plastic, one of those weatherproof storage containers you'd buy at a hardware store, gray with yellow latches. It sat on the wooden platform like someone had placed it there carefully, deliberately. No dust on the lid. Someone had been down there recently. or at least more recently than the concrete patch suggested. I should have called someone right then. Looking back, that would have been the smart move. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I was alone out there on 39 acres with no one around to tell me not to climb down into that hole. I lowered myself in, feet first, my boots landing on the wooden platform with a soft thud that sent vibrations through the dirt walls. The space was cramped, ceiling so low I had to crouch. The air was thick and hard to breathe, like being buried alive. I reached for the box, popped the yellow latches, lifted the lid. The smell hit me first, not rot but something chemical, like old perfume mixed with must and plastic. Inside were Ziploc bags, the gallon-size kind, each one labeled with black marker. Names and dates. Melissa, July 1994. Amber, November 1996. Christine, May 1998. There were 7 bags total, each one containing items that made my chest tighten. A driver's license, a necklace with a small silver cross, a hair tie, a pack of cigarettes, disposable cameras, the kind you'd buy at a gas station and drop off at a drugstore to get developed. One bag had a hospital wristband, the paper kind that disintegrates if you wear it too long, but this one was preserved, sealed away from air and time. I lifted one of the cameras, turned it over in my hands. It was light, probably no film left inside, or maybe never used at all. The bag labeled Christine had a Pennsylvania driver's license, the old style from the 90s with the Keystone logo in the corner. Her photo showed a girl with blonde hair and a shy smile, 21 years old when the picture was taken. The license had expired in 2001. Inside the same bag was a thin silver bracelet with a charm shaped like a sunflower, and a paper napkin from a place called Bernie's Roadhouse with a phone number written in blue ink. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was holding. These weren't things someone throws away. These were kept, treasured even, in the most horrifying way possible. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking now despite myself, and started taking pictures of everything. Each bag, each item, the labels with those names and dates. The crawl space suddenly seemed smaller, the air thinner, and I realized I needed to get out of there before I passed out or worse. I climbed out of that hole faster than I went in. The box clutched against my chest and walked straight to my truck without looking back at the workshop. My fingers were trembling so badly it took 3 tries to unlock my phone and dial 911. The dispatcher asked if there was an emergency, if anyone was hurt, and I didn't know how to answer that. Were these women hurt? They had to be. People don't lose their driver's licenses and precious jewelry and end up fine. I told her I'd found something on my property, something the police needed to see immediately, and she must have heard the panic in my voice because she didn't ask more questions, just said units were on the way. I sat in my truck with the doors locked, the box on the passenger seat, staring at the workshop like it might come alive and swallow me whole. 20 minutes felt like hours. When the county sheriff finally pulled up the gravel driveway, lights flashing but no siren, I practically ran to meet him. The sheriff's name was Daniels, a broad-shouldered man probably in his mid-50s with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. He listened to my explanation, looked at the box, then called for backup before we even went back to the workshop. Within an hour, my property was swarming with deputies, state police, people in plain clothes who I assumed were detectives. They taped off the entire workshop, brought in portable lights, and started photographing everything. A detective named Warren pulled me aside, asked me to walk him through exactly what happened step by step. I told him about the uneven floor, the concrete patch, the plywood, climbing down into the crawl space. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, his pen moving quickly across the page. When I mentioned the names and dates on the bags, his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like he'd been waiting for this call for a very long time. Warren told me they'd run the names through their database, see if anything came up. He asked me not to leave town, standard procedure, he said, though I could tell he didn't consider me a suspect. I was just the unlucky bastard who bought the wrong piece of land. They kept me there for hours, asking the same questions different ways, making sure my story stayed consistent. By the time they let me go back to the house, the sun was setting and more vehicles had arrived. including a white van with forensic unit printed on the side. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee, watching the lights from the workshop area sweep back and forth across my yard like searchlights. The next morning, Warren came to the house and asked if we could talk. He had a folder with him, thick with papers and photographs. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table and opened it carefully, like he was handling something fragile. The first photo he showed me was a missing person flyer from 1994. Melissa Hartley, 23 years old, last seen hitchhiking along Route 15 near Lewisburg. Blonde hair, green eyes, wearing a denim jacket and carrying a backpack. She'd been traveling from State College to visit her sister in Harrisburg and never arrived. Warren laid out more photos, more flyers. Amber Sutton disappeared in 1996 while walking home from her shift at a truck stop diner outside Sunbury. Christine Porter, the one whose license I'd held in my hands, vanished in 1998 after her car broke down on a rural road near Selinsgrove. 4 more women, all between 1994 and 2001, all from small towns within a 50-mile radius of where I was sitting. All cases that had gone cold decades ago, filed away in boxes in some basement evidence room, families still wondering, still hoping. Warren explained that they'd suspected a serial predator back then, someone who knew the area, knew the back roads, knew how to move without being noticed. But they never had physical evidence, never had a suspect, never had anything except missing women and grieving families. Until now. The items in that box matched personal effects reported missing with each woman. The disposable cameras were being sent to a lab to see if any images could be recovered. They'd already started excavating the property, bringing in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Warren's voice was steady when he told me this, professional, but I could see the weight of it in his eyes. They found the first remains 3 days later, buried in a shallow grave near the tree line at the edge of the property, maybe 200 yards from the workshop. Then another. Then 2 more in a section of woods I'd never even walked through yet. The forensic teams worked for weeks, grid by grid, marking spots with little flags whenever the dogs alerted or the radar showed anomalies. I stayed in a motel in town during most of it. Couldn't stomach being in that house knowing what was underneath my land. The media picked up the story fast. News vans lined the road outside the property. Reporters doing stand-ups with my barn in the background, helicopters circling overhead. I stopped reading the articles, stopped watching the coverage. They were calling him the Route 15 killer, even though Warren told me they'd probably never know his real hunting grounds, how far his territory actually stretched. The old man who owned the place, Howard Brennan, had died of a heart attack in his living room with no one around. Convenient, Warren said bitterly. No trial, no confession, no answers for the families about what happened to their daughters and sisters. By the time the investigation officially concluded in early June, they'd recovered the remains of 6 women from my property. One was still missing, and Warren believed she might be buried somewhere else, maybe on land that had since been developed or sold off. The families were notified, given what closure could be offered after so many years of not knowing. Some of them reached out to me, sent letters thanking me for making the call, for not just covering the hole back up and pretending I'd never seen it. I didn't feel like I deserved thanks. I just did what anyone would do, what anyone should do. The property sat empty for months after that. I couldn't sell it, not with its history plastered across every news site in the state. Eventually, I hired a crew to tear down the workshop, haul away every piece of metal and wood, and pour new concrete over where it had stood. The house I kept, though I've never spent another night there. I rented out now to a young couple who knew the story and didn't care. Said they didn't believe in ghosts or bad energy. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's just land, just a house, just wood and nails and dirt. But I know what was hidden there. I know those women deserved better than to disappear into the soil of some quiet farm where nobody thought to look. Every time I drive past on my way to visit Eugene next door, I see those yellow flags in my mind, dotting the landscape like terrible flowers, marking spots where lives ended and secrets stayed buried for 30 years. Running a small farm alone wasn't something I planned, but after my divorce went through in 2015, keeping the property felt like the only stable thing left in my life. 40 acres of corn and soybeans in rural Alabama, a white farmhouse that creaked in the wind, and a barn that desperately needed new doors. Most of the year I could manage everything myself, but harvest season always demanded extra hands. That's why I posted the job listing at the feed store in July 2023, looking for 2 temporary workers to help bring in the crops before the weather turned. I got a handful of responses, and after a few phone calls, I settled on hiring 2 guys who seemed capable enough. One was a college kid named Austin, who needed summer money before heading back to school. The other was a man who introduced himself as Elliot, maybe in his mid-40s, with a handshake that lasted a second too long and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. The first week went fine, or at least I thought it did. Austin was chatty and worked hard, always asking if he could take water breaks or use the bathroom, polite in that way young people are when they're trying to make a good impression. Elliot, though, he worked in silence mostly, but every now and then he'd pause what he was doing and just watch me. Not in an obvious way, but I'd turn around while hauling a basket of tools and catch him staring from across the field, hands on his hips, like he was studying something. He started asking questions by the 3rd day, casual at first. What time did I usually wake up? Did I lock all the doors at night? Was the house alarmed? When I told him that was none of his business, he just smiled and said he was asking because he worried about me being out here alone, that a woman by herself needed to be careful. The way he said alone made my stomach tighten, like he was confirming something he already knew. I brushed it off, told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just making conversation. But then he asked about the layout of the house, whether the bedroom was upstairs or down, and if the back door had a deadbolt or just a regular lock. By the end of that first week, I started noticing Elliot lingering after Austin left for the day. Austin would wave goodbye, hop in his beat-up sedan and drive off down the dirt road, but Elliot always found a reason to stick around an extra 20 minutes. He'd say he needed to finish organizing tools in the barn, or that he wanted to check the irrigation lines one more time, but I'd see him through the kitchen window just standing there, looking at the house. Not working, not moving, just standing with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted like he was memorizing something. One evening I walked out to tell him it was time to go, and he was standing right by the porch steps, close enough that I nearly ran into him. He didn't apologize or step back. He just looked at me and said he'd been wondering if I ever got scared out here, if I ever heard strange noises at night. When I told him no, and that he needed to leave, he nodded slowly, said goodnight, and walked toward his truck. But he kept turning around every few steps to look back at the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, the house settling, branches scraping the siding, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed, a slow, deliberate crunch of gravel outside, like someone taking careful steps to avoid making noise. I got up and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out into the yard. The motion sensor light by the barn hadn't triggered, so whoever or whatever it was hadn't gotten close enough yet. But I could see a shape moving along the tree line, slow and methodical, tracing the perimeter of the property. My first thought was a deer or maybe a coyote. We got those sometimes. But the movement was wrong. It was too steady, too purposeful. The shape stopped near the side of the house, right below my bedroom window, and just stood there. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After what felt like forever, the shape moved again, heading toward the front porch, and I heard the soft creak of the wooden steps under weight. Footsteps. Human footsteps. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and pulled up the security camera app I'd installed a few months back. Nothing fancy. Just a single camera pointed at the front door that recorded to the cloud. The feed loaded slowly, buffering in that maddening way it does when you need it most. And when the image finally appeared, my chest went tight. There was Elliot, standing directly in front of the camera, staring straight into the lens. Not moving, not knocking, just standing there with his face maybe 6 inches from the camera, close enough that I could see the reflection of the porch light in his eyes. His expression was blank, completely neutral, like he was waiting for something or testing something. I watched, frozen, as he stayed there for what must have been 30 seconds, and then the feed flickered once, twice, and went black. The app said "connection lost" in gray text at the bottom of the screen. I tried refreshing it, closing and reopening the app, even restarting my phone, but the camera wouldn't come back online. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. The next morning I went outside to check the camera, and the lens was covered in a smear of something, mud or grease, I couldn't tell, but it had been deliberately wiped across it so the camera couldn't record anything clearly. The memory card inside was gone too, popped right out of the slot and taken. I stood there on the porch staring at the empty slot, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't random. This wasn't some confused drifter who wandered onto my property. Elliot had walked the perimeter of my house in the middle of the night, stood outside my bedroom window, climbed my porch steps, disabled my only security measure, and stolen the evidence. When he and Austin showed up for work an hour later, Elliot looked exactly the same as always, calm and quiet, offering me a polite nod as he grabbed his gloves from the barn. I wanted to scream at him, to demand what the hell he thought he was doing, but something in the way he looked at me, steady and patient, made the words catch in my throat. Austin was oblivious, talking about some party he'd gone to over the weekend, but Elliot just worked in silence, occasionally glancing toward the house like he was checking on it. I decided right then that I needed to fire him, had to get him off my property before things got worse. Around lunchtime, I pulled him aside, away from Austin, and told him as calmly as I could manage that I didn't need his help anymore, that I'd pay him for the week, but he should collect his things and go. The change in his face was immediate. That blank, neutral expression twisted into something darker, his jaw tightening and his eyes narrowing like I'd just insulted him. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the sweat and dirt on him, and said in a low voice that he didn't take orders from people who hide things. I had no idea what he meant, and I told him so, but he just shook his head slowly and said I knew exactly what he was talking about. When I insisted he leave, he crossed his arms and said no. Just like that. No. He said he had every right to be here, that he'd signed on for the whole harvest season, and if I tried to force him off the property, he'd make sure everyone in town knew what kind of person I really was. The threat was vague enough that it didn't make sense, but specific enough that it scared me. He wasn't yelling, wasn't being violent, but the way he stood there, immovable and confident, made it clear he had no intention of leaving. That afternoon, I called the sheriff's office, explained the situation as best I could without sounding hysterical. The deputy who answered said unless Elliot had physically threatened me or damaged my property, there wasn't much they could do. Trespassing required him to refuse to leave after being formally warned, and since he was technically still employed, even if I wanted him gone, it was a civil matter. He suggested I document everything, maybe get a restraining order if things escalated, but that could take days to process. I hung up feeling helpless and furious, trapped on my own land with someone who clearly had plans I couldn't begin to understand. Austin finished up his work around 4 and headed home like usual, waving goodbye and saying he'd see me the next day. Elliot, though, he stayed. He didn't even pretend to work. He just sat on an overturned bucket near the barn, facing the house, watching me through the kitchen window as I moved around inside. When I turned off the lights and went upstairs, I saw his truck still parked by the road, headlights off, just sitting there in the dusk like a predator waiting for night to fall. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the hallway upstairs with a baseball bat across my lap and my phone in my hand, listening to every sound the house made. Around 11, I heard the gravel driveway crunch, slow and deliberate, the same pattern as the night before. Then came the sound of the barn doors creaking open, the old metal hinges groaning in protest. He was inside the barn. I could picture him in there, moving through the shadows, maybe looking through my tools, my supplies, learning the space. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel again, circling around the side of the house. They stopped right below the bathroom window, and I heard a faint scraping sound, like something metal dragging across the siding. My whole body was tense, every muscle locked, waiting for the sound of breaking glass or a door being forced open. Instead, the footsteps moved again, this time toward the back of the house. I heard the back door handle twist. Once, twice, testing it. I'd locked it, I knew I had, but hearing someone try it anyway made my breath come in short, panicked gasps. The handle stopped moving and for a moment there was complete silence. Then I heard his voice, muffled through the door but clear enough to understand. He said he knew I was awake, that he could see the light from my phone glowing in the upstairs window. He said I should just let him in so we could talk, that he wasn't trying to scare me. He just wanted to have a conversation about things I'd been keeping from him. I had no idea what he meant and I didn't answer. My throat was too tight to speak, and even if I could, I wasn't going to engage with him. After another long silence, I heard his footsteps retreat across the gravel, but they didn't go far. They stopped somewhere near the side yard, and then I heard the soft click of a lighter and smelled cigarette smoke drifting through the window screen. He was smoking out there, just standing in my yard in the middle of the night like he owned the place. I stayed frozen in that hallway until the sun started to rise, and when I finally looked out the window, his truck was gone. I called my brother in Georgia the second it was a decent hour, and he drove up that same day with two of his friends, both big guys who worked construction. I told them everything, showed them the disabled camera, described the nights of stalking and the refusal to leave. When Elliot showed up for work that afternoon, he saw the three of them standing on my porch with their arms crossed, and for the first time since I'd met him, his expression changed. The confidence drained out of his face, replaced by something cautious, almost nervous. My brother walked right up to him and told him in no uncertain terms that he was done here, that if he ever set foot on this property again or came within a mile of me, they'd make sure he regretted it. Elliot didn't argue, he didn't say a word. He just stared at me for a long moment, like he was memorizing my face, then turned and walked back to his truck. He drove off slowly, and I watched until his taillights disappeared down the road. For the next week, my brother and his friends stayed with me, sleeping in the guest room and taking shifts keeping watch at night. Elliot never came back. I checked with Austin a few days later, and he said Elliot had called him once, asking weird questions about whether I'd said anything about him, whether the police had been involved, but Austin told him he didn't know anything and to stop calling. I changed all the locks on the house, installed 3 new cameras with backup power supplies, and got a dog, a German shepherd named Juno who barks at everything that moves. The barn doors got new locks too, industrial-strength deadbolts that can't be opened from the outside. I eventually finished the harvest with Austin's help, and a couple of day laborers from a staffing agency that actually ran background checks. I never found out what Elliot meant by his accusations, what he thought I was hiding, and honestly, I don't care. Maybe he was delusional, maybe he was on something, or maybe he was just a dangerous man looking for a vulnerable target. Whatever it was, I got lucky that my brother showed up when he did. Even now, a year later, I still think about those nights. I think about how close I came to being completely alone with someone who had studied my routines, disabled my security, and refused to leave even when told directly. I think about the way he tested that back door handle, the way he stood in my yard smoking a cigarette like he had all the time in the world. The worst part isn't even what happened. It's knowing how much worse it could have been if I hadn't made that call, if my brother hadn't dropped everything to help me. I don't hire temporary workers anymore. I either do the harvest myself, or I pay a professional crew with insurance and references I can verify. Juno sleeps at the foot of my bed every night, and I still check the cameras obsessively before I go to sleep, watching the feeds until I'm sure nothing's moving out there in the dark. People ask me sometimes if I ever saw Elliot again, if he ever came back, and the answer is no. But I still lock every door twice, and I still wake up at the smallest sound, and I probably always will. Life on our farm had been running in a steady rhythm when all of this happened. I'd been juggling chores, raising 2 kids, and helping my spouse plan a long overdue remodel of the old farmhouse bedroom. The place was built in the 1950s, and still carried that stubborn, creaky personality of homes that have seen too many seasons. We talked for years about opening up that room to make space for a proper desk and some shelves, since the kids kept spreading their school projects all over the kitchen table. That morning felt ordinary enough. Sunlight coming through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee drifting through the hall, nothing hinting that the day would take such a sharp turn. The crew we hired was small, just 2 workers, both locals who had fixed half the barns within a 20-mile radius. One of them, a guy named Shane, had a habit of humming old country tunes while he worked, which always echoed weirdly in the narrow hallway. I remember carrying a basket of laundry when I heard his humming stop all at once. Not like he took a break, more like his attention got yanked away by something he didn't expect. By the time I walked toward the bedroom, he was standing on a ladder with a piece of drywall still in his hand, staring at a dark recess in the wall like he'd stumbled onto a tunnel. Bits of insulation were floating in the air, drifting down like strange yellow snowflakes. I asked him if everything was okay, and he answered in this strange half-whisper, telling me he'd found a hollow pocket sealed off behind the studs. It wasn't part of the room's layout. It shouldn't have existed. He pulled his flashlight from his belt and tilted it inside the space. From where I stood, I could smell something damp, stale, almost like a cellar no one had touched in decades. He climbed down and motioned for me to stay back, and that was the moment the air around us seemed to stretch thin. A moment later, he reached into the cavity and stepped away fast, dropping a sheet-wrapped bundle onto the tarp. The bundle wasn't big, no more than the size of a household pillow, but the corners sagged in a way that made my knees feel weak. When he peeled the sheet open just enough to see what was inside, the room felt smaller than it had ever been. It wasn't a full skeleton, not neatly arranged, just a cluster of small bones gathered together, tangled in a mold-stained bedsheet. The fabric looked older than anything in that house, the kind of decay you only see when time has been eating away in secret. The worker didn't touch anything again, and I remember stepping back until my shoulder hit the hallway wall. My mind kept trying to attach a logical explanation. Animals, debris, some bizarre mistake. But deep down, I already understood this was no accident. Within minutes, we'd called the sheriff's office, and that normal, peaceful morning evaporated into something I still think about every single night. The deputies arrived quicker than I expected, their boots leaving dusty prints along our hallway runner. One of them, a woman named Deputy Marin, crouched beside the bundle with a steadiness that didn't quite match the tension in her jaw. She didn't touch the bones, just studied them, shining her flashlight in small, controlled motions. The other deputy stood near the window, scribbling something in his notebook while asking basic questions about the remodel, about when the wall had last been opened, about the house's previous owners. I kept thinking about how many mornings I'd walked past that very spot in the wall without knowing there was a person, or what remained of one, sealed inside for who knows how long. By mid-afternoon, detectives joined the deputies, along with a crime scene tech who laid out a blue tarp and started photographing every angle of the cavity. They moved carefully, almost reverently, like they didn't want to disturb the quiet lingering in the home's bones. The lead detective, a man named Harris, spoke calmly as he explained they suspected the remains belonged to a woman who had vanished ages ago. He didn't give many details at first, but his tone carried the weight of something long forgotten, or purposely buried. He asked if I'd heard anything strange from neighbors about the property's past. I told him the truth. We'd heard bits and pieces, mostly old gossip about a previous owner who drank too much and argued loudly with his wife, but no one ever hinted at anything like this. Later that evening, the techs finally removed the bones, still wrapped in the decayed sheet, placing them into a container that looked too clinical for something that carried so much human sadness. Watching them carry it through the hallway felt surreal, especially with my kids sitting quietly in the living room, sensing the heaviness in the air. Detective Harris stayed behind to walk through the rest of the house with me and my spouse, asking about odd structural quirks, any renovations done before we moved in, or stories the realtor had shared. At one point, he paused near the back door, tapping the frame as if something about the house was speaking to him in a language he recognized. The next day, neighbors started showing up, Not in a nosy way, but with this cautious curiosity, like they were stepping into a story they'd tried to forget. An older man from down the road, Mick, leaned on our porch railing and told the detectives the former owner had been infamous for his temper. He described nights when shouting carried across the fields, followed by stretches of silence so long they made the livestock restless. Another neighbor, Janet, mentioned how the owner's wife had left suddenly decades ago, with no forwarding address and no goodbyes. People assumed she'd run off to escape the chaos of her marriage, and no one questioned it because back then, questioning meant getting involved in someone else's firestorm. Hearing them talk, piece by piece, felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself into an image no one wanted to see. Detective Harris returned 2 days later with a quiet seriousness that made me set aside everything I was doing. He explained that the remains had been confirmed as belonging to the woman neighbors remembered, the one everyone believed had simply packed up and left. He told us the way she was found, wrapped tightly and placed inside a sealed cavity, suggested she hadn't gone anywhere by choice. Hearing that said out loud made the house feel heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He asked me to walk him through the moment the workers opened the wall again, and even though I'd already told the story several times, repeating it to him felt different. There was something in his eyes that made it clear this case wasn't going to fade quietly. A few evenings later, after the kids went to bed, my spouse and I sat in the living room talking about everything the investigation had stirred up. I kept glancing toward the closed bedroom door, imagining the empty cavity behind the studs. The space looked harmless now, just wood and wiring, yet my mind kept circling back to the idea that someone had sealed that woman away, likely in a moment of rage or fear, and gone on living in the house as if nothing had happened. I couldn't stop wondering how many arguments, how many slammed doors, how many desperate moments had happened in those same rooms before we ever set foot inside. The thought clung to me like humidity before a storm. The detectives eventually pieced together a rough timeline. Based on the neighbors' recollections and records from old hospital visits and police calls, the former owner had been spiraling for years. They believed the crime happened during one of his violent episodes. He had died several years before we bought the place, and whatever secrets he carried were buried with him, at least until our renovation peeled back the layers he'd left behind. Learning that there would be no confession, no confrontation, no real explanation left a strange hollowness inside me. Justice felt incomplete, like a door left slightly open without anyone willing to close it. Over the following weeks, we finished the remodel, though the room never felt the same. The drywall was new, the paint fresh, but every time I stepped inside, I felt a faint heaviness in the air. Not fear exactly, but a deep awareness of the past. Sometimes, when the house settled at night and the wood popped the way old houses do, I'd picture the woman who never got the chance to leave the farm alive. We added a small framed wildflower print to the new shelf in her memory, even though we never knew her name personally. It seemed wrong to pretend nothing had happened, and yet life continued, kids doing homework, meals on the stove, the dogs barking at passing tractors. The house had carried a terrible secret for decades, but now that it had been uncovered, all we could do was acknowledge it and move forward. Growing up around farmland shaped the kind of person I became, but I never imagined I'd end up owning a place with a reputation whispered about in diners and gas stations. When I took over that property, I was juggling 2 part-time jobs and trying to stabilize my life after a messy breakup, so I didn't have the luxury of giving in to local rumors. The cornfield behind the house had this odd habit of sagging in the same area every warm season, creating a shallow dip no matter how often I tried to level it out. Neighbors told me the previous operator never managed to fix it either, but I assumed it was just years of sloppy irrigation. At that point, I was focused on catching up on bills, keeping the equipment running, and convincing myself I hadn't made a stupid financial decision. The land looked healthy enough, and nothing about that sinking patch seemed dangerous, just annoying and inconvenient. By the time early summer rolled around, I finally saved enough to bring in a small crew to help regrade the field properly. The morning they arrived, I remember feeling this strange mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief because the problem would finally be dealt with, and embarrassment because the crew leader, a guy named Spencer, kept pointing out the signs of past erosion that I should have noticed myself. As they started moving soil, the machinery kept giving off this uneven groan, the kind it makes when it's fighting something that shouldn't be there. I figured it was just compacted earth or some old farm debris, maybe forgotten fence posts or rusted tools buried over time. Still, watching the blade screech as it scraped against something solid made me shift my weight from one foot to the other, unsure if we were about to uncover a rock the size of a fridge or a damaged pipe, waiting to explode water everywhere. It didn't take long before the crew realized the obstacle wasn't stone or metal piping. When the machine lifted its blade again, there was a faint clank, the kind that sounded too smooth, too deliberate to be scrap. Spencer waved me over and pointed to a thin sliver of metal poking through the dirt, perfectly straight and coated in this dull bluish gray that didn't match anything used on the farm. The workers formed a loose semicircle, muttering guesses to each other while scraping the soil away by hand. Even from a few feet back, I could tell whatever we'd hit wasn't small. A rectangular outline began to appear, corners sharp enough to stand out from the surrounding earth. One of the younger workers asked if I had ever buried equipment out here, and I laughed in a way that didn't feel natural, mostly to hide the tension building behind my ribs. The moment they uncovered the front grille, even partially, everything around us went strangely quiet. I recognized the shape instantly. The nose of a pickup truck wedged upright in the ground like someone had dropped it from the sky. The metal was warped in places, caked with soil, but the brand emblem was still visible despite the grime. Spencer kept brushing away dirt, eventually revealing the windshield, or what was left of it. The glass had shattered ages ago, leaving jagged edges embedded in the frame. When he aimed his flashlight into the cabin, nobody spoke for a good 10 seconds. Inside, slumped against the steering column, was a human shape still buckled in place. The clothing was faded and barely recognizable, but the outline of a body was unmistakable. I felt this tightening inside my chest, not from fear exactly, but from the abrupt realization that the land I'd been tending like it was mine alone had been hiding someone's final moments. News travels fast in small communities, and within an hour the property felt less like my farm and more like a crime scene. Patrol cars rolled down the gravel path one after another, kicking up dust that clung to the air like powder. An officer directed me to stand near the fence while they set up a perimeter, and I remember gripping the wood rail, trying to process the idea that this field had been holding someone's secret for so long. The sheriff on site, a man named Hendrik, asked a handful of routine questions, but his expression grew sharper the moment I mentioned the name of the farm's previous operator. I'd always known the man by reputation only, someone people described with vague discomfort, the type who made deals in back rooms and avoided eye contact. I had no idea that what he left behind might be more than neglected machinery and unpaid debts. When the crew finally managed to widen the dig site enough to pull the truck free, the vertical orientation became even more unsettling. It stood almost perfectly straight when they lifted it with the winch, like some grave marker that had been hidden under the soil. Hendrik kept pacing around it with the kind of focus I'd only ever seen in people trying to piece together something bigger than a simple accident. A forensic tech leaned inside the cab and confirmed that the driver had never escaped, never even unbuckled. The position of the body suggested a sudden impact, but the angle and depth in which the truck was buried made the explanation impossible to accept as an accident. By that point, a few locals had gathered near the road, each one talking in low tones, throwing uneasy glances my way, as if I were somehow responsible for not knowing what had been beneath my own land. Later that afternoon, investigators traced the license plate and matched the truck to a missing persons case that had nearly slipped out of collective memory. The owner was identified as Joel Mercer, a guy who'd vanished 2 decades earlier after leaving a bar on the edge of town. I'd heard his name once or twice in passing, mostly in stories older men told after a couple drinks, nameless warnings about choosing better company and not trusting certain folks. Hendrik explained that Joel had been involved in a confrontation shortly before he disappeared, a heated argument with the man who used to run my farm. Apparently, Joel had accused him of dealing in stolen vehicles, but no one ever proved anything. When Joel never came home, the theory that he'd run off on his own became the easiest one to accept, especially once the farm changed hands and that whole chapter faded into rumor. What unsettled me most was realizing how often I'd walked across that sinking patch, how many mornings I'd passed over it with coffee in hand without noticing anything more than a soft depression in the earth. The idea that a man had been trapped down there while seasons changed overhead gave me a sense of weight I couldn't explain. Investigators kept expanding the search radius, combing through the rest of the field as if expecting to find more surprises. Watching heavy machinery peel back layers of soil made the farm feel unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Even the air felt different, as though the land itself had been waiting for someone to uncover its history and finally acknowledge the truth buried beneath it. As the evening stretched on, Hendrik pulled me aside and told me something that still clings to my thoughts whenever I walk that field. Years ago, before the farm changed owners, neighbors had reported hearing machinery running long after midnight, engines revving, metal clanging, strange activity with headlights sweeping across the corn rows. Most assumed the operator was working odd hours because he was difficult to deal with and preferred avoiding people. No one imagined those late nights might have involved burying a truck vertically with someone inside. The sheriff's tone implied he believed the man had help, or at least enough privacy to carry out something so heavy and deliberate. Standing there in the fading light, I couldn't stop imagining the moment the ground swallowed Joel's truck, how quickly the soil must have collapsed around it, erasing every trace until only that slow seasonal sinking hinted at what lay beneath. The authorities wrapped up their work sometime after nightfall, leaving deep trenches and equipment tracks carved across the field. For the first time since buying the place, I didn't feel any attachment to the land, just a strange heaviness, like the farm had been carrying a burden and had finally dropped it into my hands. Word spread through town that more arrests might follow, that people connected to the former operator were being questioned. A detective mentioned that receipts, forged documents, and scrap parts had surfaced in places no one expected. Every new detail pushed the story further away from simple tragedy and closer to a network of crimes that had been overlooked for far too long. Meanwhile, Joel's family was located and notified, reopening wounds they thought had finally scarred over. Over the next week, I struggled to resume anything resembling routine. Walking into the barn felt different. Stepping outside at dawn felt different. Even simple chores made me overly aware of the ground beneath my boots. I kept thinking about the years Joel spent hidden below the soil while life continued overhead. Birthdays, storms, new owners, harvest seasons. The crew eventually filled the massive excavation and leveled the ground again, but the land never returned to how it looked before. The patch where the truck had been removed settled unevenly, creating a subtle ridge instead of a dip. I didn't bother correcting it. Maybe part of me felt the land deserved to keep a scar of its own, something honest that marked what had happened instead of swallowing it again. A month later, after all the interviews, reports, and cleanup, the sheriff returned to hand me the last of the paperwork. He told me the case would finally be closed soon, and that the former operator, now living far from here, was facing charges connected not only to Joel but to several vehicles reported stolen around the same period. Hearing that brought me a kind of closure I didn't expect. I stood there with the folder in my hand, looking out across the cornfield while the wind moved through the rows like a slow hush. The land felt quieter than before, almost as though it had released something old and heavy. I still don't understand every piece of what happened on that property long before I arrived, but at least the truth isn't buried anymore. And strangely, that makes it easier to live here now, even if I'll never walk that field again without thinking of the man who never made it home. Something about that morning still clings to me. Maybe because life on the ranch had finally started to feel steady again after a messy stretch of debts and repairs. I'd taken over the place from an older couple who moved south to be closer to their grandkids, and they left behind a few things they figured I'd grow into, including a big livestock guardian dog named Ranger. He had a blocky head, pale eyes that always looked half-focused on something far away, and a habit of pacing the fence line like he was tracking a ghost. I didn't mind. Quiet company suited me. Most days were just feed runs, checking the water tanks and trying to keep coyotes from getting bold. Nothing suggested that anything in my pasture held a secret worth remembering, much less retelling. At first, Ranger's odd habit barely registered. Every afternoon, as predictable as the sunset, he would tug old metal tools, chunks of plastic, even a cracked bucket or two across the pasture. He dragged everything to the far western corner, where the grass grew in a crooked swirl because the soil never seemed to decide if it wanted to be sandy or packed hard. I figured he was building himself some kind of nest, the way bored animals sometimes do. But there was something strange in the way he worked. Steady, determined, almost methodical. Whenever I called him back, he'd glance at me, then return to nudging whatever scrap he'd found toward that same patch of ground. I joked aloud once, telling him he looked like he was starting a junkyard, but his focus didn't shift for a second. After a couple of weeks, irritation started creeping in. I kept finding random farm tools missing from the shed, small things like a trowel or wire cutters, stuff I knew I hadn't misplaced. And every single item showed up in that same corner, half nestled into the dirt like Ranger wanted to bury the whole ranch there. One afternoon, after tripping over a cracked feed pan he had dragged out, I decided enough was enough. I clipped his leash on and tried pulling him away from the area to break the routine. He resisted in a way that surprised me, not aggressive, just solid, like a tree leaning into the wind. The moment I let the tension slacken, he went straight back, planted his paws and stared at a particular spot on the ground, as if waiting for me to finally catch on. That stare worked on me more than anything else. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't excitement. It was more like he held a piece of knowledge he didn't know how to deliver. I crouched down where he kept pointing his attention, and noticed a shallow dip in the soil. Not deep, not obvious, but unnatural in a pasture that usually settled evenly. The grass there grew shorter, almost sunken, as if weight had pressed it down repeatedly. I pushed my fingers into the dirt just to feel the texture, and it crumbled looser than the surrounding ground. That was the first moment I felt a quiet pressure building in my chest, the kind that comes when part of your mind knows there's only one way this ends, and the other part begs you to walk away. I went back to the house for a shovel, telling myself I was just humoring a dog with quirks. But the whole walk back to that corner felt heavier than it should have. Ranger didn't wander or sniff around the way he usually did. He stayed close, moving with a strange patience, like he knew exactly what I was about to uncover. The soil gave way faster than I expected. A couple of scoops in, the loose top layer fell apart, exposing darker, colder earth beneath it. The smell shifted too, not rotten, not fresh, just a dull, stale scent that didn't belong in open pasture. Ranger stepped back and sat down, rigid and alert. His gaze locked on the hole as if he were bracing for something I hadn't yet seen. The first unmistakable thing I uncovered was a scrap of fabric. Pale, dirty, and frayed. It clung to the soil like it had been swallowed whole over time. The sight of it knocked something loose in my memory. A local news segment from years before about a woman whose car had broken down on a rural highway not far from here. They said she vanished while waiting for help. Volunteers had searched ditches and fields up and down the road, but eventually the coverage faded, swallowed by newer stories. Still, that scrap of fabric felt like a message from a past everyone had quietly filed away. My throat tightened as I dug a little deeper, hands working slower now, careful, almost reluctant. Then I uncovered the unmistakable curve of a bone, human, thin, small. I didn't need to see any more to understand what Ranger had been trying to tell me all along. I set the shovel down and stepped back, my legs buzzing with an energy that made it hard to stand still. Ranger didn't move closer or farther. He just stayed there beside me, breathing slow, steady, almost grounding. I took out my phone with a clumsy urgency, dialing the sheriff's office and trying to explain what I'd found without letting my voice crack. They told me not to touch anything else, not to dig further, and to wait at the fence line until deputies arrived. The investigators showed up faster than I expected, likely because missing person cases, even old ones, still sit heavy on people's minds out here. They cordoned off the area, thanked me for stopping when I did, and brought in a forensic team before the sun dipped low. I sat on the tailgate of my truck with Ranger leaning against my leg, the both of us watching strangers move around a place that had always felt familiar until that afternoon. When the sheriff approached me, his face carried a mix of sympathy and exhaustion that told me what I already suspected. The remains likely belonged to the woman who had disappeared 3 years earlier. He mentioned something else too, a former farmhand who had worked for the previous owners. A man who left suddenly, never collected his last paycheck, and was seen near the stranded woman's car the day she vanished. What struck me later was how none of this ever came up when I bought the ranch. The previous owners mentioned that the old farmhand, a guy named Mason, had quit without warning, but they chalked it up to him being unreliable. They never hinted at anything darker, and maybe they truly didn't know. Investigators questioned me about anything he might have left behind, any odd stories, any places he favored on the property. I didn't have much to offer, just a memory of an empty bunkhouse with a cigarette burn on the windowsill and a broken radio lying on the floor, as if whoever lived there left in a rush. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the sheriff told me they were issuing new warrants and reaching out to nearby counties, almost certain they were dealing with a man who hadn't simply walked off a job. In the days that followed, the ranch felt different. Not haunted, just heavier, as if the land itself had been holding something in its lungs for years and had finally exhaled. Ranger stayed close to me every morning, not pacing, not gathering scraps, just calm in a way I hadn't seen before. A detective stopped by to tell me they'd confirmed the remains belonged to the missing woman. They found personal items buried slightly deeper, fragments of a purse, a key fob, a bracelet with tiny teal stones. I didn't know her, but seeing those objects made everything ache in a way I hadn't expected. It turned the story from a headline into a person. When word got out, a few locals dropped by with casseroles and uneasy small talk, the way people do when tragedy brushes too close to their world. One older resident told me he remembered seeing the farmhand at a gas station the same week the woman disappeared, loading something into the back of an old pickup with mismatched doors. Nobody thought much of it at the time. People around here keep their eyes on their own problems unless something screams for attention. Hearing that made me look at the pasture differently. How close everything had been. How easily it could have stayed hidden forever if not for a dog who refused to give up. Eventually, the investigators packed up their equipment, the media attention drifted elsewhere, and the ranch settled back into its usual rhythm. But the corner of that pasture never felt like just another patch of land again. I installed a small wooden marker there. Not a memorial exactly, just something to acknowledge what the ground had held. Ranger visits it sometimes, sitting quietly as if keeping a final watch. They never found Mason, but the sheriff believes they will. People like him always leave a trail somewhere down the line. As for me, life goes on in the slow, steady way it always has out here. But I trust Ranger a little differently now. When he stops and stares at something, I pay attention. He saw the truth long before I ever did. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Grandma Eloise passed away on a Friday morning in April 2024, and by Sunday afternoon, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom closet, surrounded by decades of her life packed into cardboard boxes. My mother had asked me to help sort through everything since she could barely step into the house without breaking down. At 26, fresh out of a failed engagement and temporarily crashing at my parents' place in rural Virginia, I had nothing but time on my hands. Grandma and I had always been close, the kind of close where she would call me her little co-conspirator whenever we snuck extra dessert before dinner. She lived alone in that old farmhouse for 11 years after Grandpa Harold died, refusing to move despite everyone's concerns. The house smelled like her lavender hand cream and old books, and going through her things felt like reading her diary without permission. I expected to find old recipes, maybe some love letters from Grandpa, perhaps photographs from her years as a schoolteacher. What I did not expect was for my entire understanding of who she was to collapse within the span of a single afternoon. The first few boxes contained exactly what you would imagine. Report cards she had saved from students who had written sweet notes on the back, Christmas cards dating back to the 70s, receipts she had kept for absolutely no logical reason. I was actually smiling, shaking my head at how she had hoarded rubber bands in a mason jar, like they were precious gems. Then I pulled out a shoebox from the very back of her closet, hidden behind a stack of quilts she had sewn herself. It was heavier than it should have been, and the lid was secured with a thick rubber band that had nearly fused to the cardboard. When I finally pried it open, I found a bundle of documents wrapped in a faded silk scarf, the kind with hand-rolled edges that women wore in old Hollywood movies. There was a marriage certificate on top, yellowed and brittle, dated June 1961. The bride's name was Eloise Marie Compton, my grandmother's maiden name, but the groom was not Harold Weston, the man I had called Grandpa my entire life. The name typed in careful black letters was Vincent Agostino, and seeing it there made me feel like I had just stepped through a trap door into a room that was never supposed to exist. I sat there for a long time just staring at that certificate, trying to make it fit into the story of my grandmother that I had known my whole life. She married Grandpa Harold in 1965. I knew that because their anniversary was always a big deal, always celebrated with her famous lemon cake and too many candles. But this certificate said she had been married 4 years before that, to a man none of us had ever heard of. I carefully unfolded the other documents in the bundle, my fingers leaving smudges on paper that had not been touched in decades. There were photographs, small square ones with scalloped edges, the kind they used to take at photo booths. My grandmother, impossibly young, maybe 19 or 20, with victory rolls in her dark hair and red lipstick that photographed almost black. And next to her, a man with slicked back hair, a sharp jaw, and eyes that looked like they were keeping secrets even in a snapshot. He was handsome in a dangerous way, the kind of handsome that mothers warned their daughters about. On the back of one photo, in my grandmother's careful cursive, were the words, "V and me, Coney Island, June 1961. Beneath the photographs, I found newspaper clippings, brittle and brown at the edges, folded into small squares like someone had been hiding them for a very long time. The first one was from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, dated March 1963. The headline read, "Local businessman sought for questioning in warehouse fire." There was no photo, but the article mentioned a Vincent Agostino, age 24, believed to be connected to the Marano crime family operating out of Red Hook. 3 men had died in that fire. The article said investigators suspected arson, that the warehouse had been used as a front for illegal gambling operations, and that Agostino had not been seen since the night of the blaze. I read it 3 times, waiting for the words to change, waiting for some other Vincent Agostino to appear, a different man with the same name, a coincidence that would let me keep my grandmother intact. But the next clipping was worse. It was from 2 weeks later, a smaller article buried on page 6, reporting that Vincent Agostino was now considered a missing person. His car had been found abandoned near the docks in Staten Island, doors open, keys still in the ignition. There was blood on the front seat. He was never seen again. My hands moved on their own after that, pulling out more papers, more secrets. There was a letter, handwritten on plain white paper, no envelope, no date. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, nothing like my grandmother's elegant script. It read, "Ellie, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Do not look for me. Do not ask questions. Forget you ever knew my name. They will come asking and you must tell them nothing. You were never my wife, we never met. Burn this letter and everything else. I am sorry for what I brought into your life. V." She had not burned it. She had kept it for over 60 years, tucked away in this shoebox along with her marriage certificate and those photographs and those terrible newspaper clippings. I tried to imagine her as a young woman, barely 22 years old, receiving this letter, realizing that her husband was either dead or running for his life, and that she could never speak of him again. I tried to imagine the fear she must have felt, the grief she could not share with anyone, the weight of pretending he had never existed. At the very bottom of the shoebox, beneath everything else, I found a small spiral notebook with a faded green cover. It was a diary of sorts, though not quite, more like scattered notes written in my grandmother's handwriting at different times over many years. The first entry was dated April 1963, just weeks after Vincent disappeared. Men came to the apartment today, 2 of them. They asked about V. I told them I did not know anyone by that name. They did not believe me. One of them grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises. They said they would be back. I turned the page with shaking fingers. May 1963, moved to Virginia. Changed my name back to Compton. Told everyone I was a widow, that my husband died in Korea. No one questions a war widow. The entries continued, sparse but devastating. In 1965, she wrote about meeting Harold, a kind man who worked at the post office and brought her flowers every Sunday. In 1967, she wrote about their wedding, about how happy she was, about how she had finally started to feel safe. But then, in 1971, another entry. A man came to the school today, said he was looking for an old friend named Eli Agostino. I told him there was no one here by that name. He smiled at me before he left. He knew. They still know. I kept reading, unable to stop, each entry pulling me deeper into a life I never knew existed. The entries were not frequent. Sometimes years would pass between them, but they painted a picture of constant, quiet terror. In 1978, she wrote about a black sedan that parked outside their house for 3 days straight, before finally driving away. She never told Harold. In 1985, when my mother was a teenager, someone broke into their car and rifled through the glove compartment, but took nothing of value. They were looking for something, my grandmother wrote, or sending a message. I do not know which is worse. In 1993, she received a sympathy card in the mail after her own mother's funeral. It was unsigned, postmarked from Brooklyn, and inside someone had written only, "Our condolences to the Agostino family." She kept that card too, pressed between the pages of the notebook like a dried flower, a reminder of a threat that never quite went away. I realized then that my grandmother had spent her entire adult life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to finally catch up with her. The last entry in the notebook was dated just 3 years ago, in 2022. My grandmother's handwriting had grown shaky by then, the letters wobbly and uneven in a way that made my chest ache. I am 83 years old and I still check the locks twice every night. I still look at every unfamiliar car that drives down our road. Harold has been gone for over a decade now, and I am alone with this secret, the way I always knew I would be. Sometimes I think about telling the children, about leaving this box for them to find after I'm gone. But what good would it do? The men who killed Vincent are probably dead themselves by now. The Moranos are gone, broken up by the FBI in the 80s. There is no one left to be afraid of. And yet, I am still afraid. I have been afraid for 60 years, and I do not know how to stop. Maybe when I die, the fear will finally die with me. Maybe that is the only way it ends. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, and I sat there in my dead grandmother's closet and cried for the terrified young woman she had been, and for all the years she spent carrying this weight alone. I do not know how long I stayed in that closet. The light coming through the bedroom window had shifted from afternoon gold to the soft gray of early evening by the time I finally pulled myself together. I put everything back in the shoebox, the certificate, the photographs, the clippings, the letter, the notebook, and I carried it downstairs to the kitchen table. My mother was coming back the next morning to continue sorting through things, and I had a decision to make. Did I tell her? Did I show her this box and watch her entire understanding of her own mother collapse the way mine had? Grandma Eloise had kept this secret for over 60 years. She had protected her family from this knowledge, had borne the weight of it alone so that they would never have to be afraid the way she was afraid. Part of me wanted to honor that sacrifice, to take this box out to the backyard and burn it the way Vincent had asked her to do all those years ago. But another part of me, a louder part, needed to know more. I needed to understand what had really happened to Vincent Agostino, and whether the threat my grandmother feared her whole life had ever been real at all. I spent that night at the kitchen table with my laptop, falling down a rabbit hole of old newspaper archives and genealogy websites and true crime forums dedicated to organized crime in mid-century New York. The Morano family had been real, a small but violent outfit that operated out of Brooklyn from the late 40s until the FBI dismantled them in 1987. They were known for gambling, loan sharking, and arson for hire. Vincent Agostino's name appeared in a few digitized court documents from the era, listed as a known associate, but never formally charged with anything. His disappearance in March 1963 was mentioned in a true crime book about unsolved mob murders that someone had excerpted on a forum. The author speculated that Vincent had either been killed by the Moranos for skimming money, or that he had been an informant who was eliminated before he could testify. Either way, his body was never found. There was no closure, no resolution, just a young man who walked into the fog of history and never came back. And my grandmother, barely out of her teens, had been married to him for less than 2 years before he vanished. She had spent the rest of her life waiting for the people who killed him to come for her too. Around 2 in the morning, I found something that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the screen for a long time. It was a photograph in a digitized FBI file from the Morano investigation, released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act. The image was grainy, black and white, showing a group of men standing outside a social club in Red Hook sometime in the early 60s. Most of the faces were labeled with names I did not recognize, soldiers and associates long dead or imprisoned. But in the corner of the frame, partially cut off, was a young man in a dark coat looking directly at the camera. The label beneath him read, V. Agostino, unconfirmed. I zoomed in as much as the resolution would allow, and even through the blur of age and pixels, I recognized the sharp jaw, the slicked back hair, those eyes that seemed to be keeping secrets. It was him. It was really him. My grandmother had married that man, had shared a bed with him, had probably loved him in the desperate way young people love before they understand what love costs. And he had walked away from her into a world of violence and shadows and never come back. I decided that night to keep the shoebox. I did not burn it, and I did not show it to my mother. Not right away, at least. Instead, I put it in the trunk of my car and drove back to my parents' house, and I spent the next few weeks trying to figure out what to do with the weight of what I had learned. Eventually, I did tell my mother. I waited until a quiet Sunday afternoon when my father was out golfing, and I sat her down at the kitchen table and opened the box in front of her. She cried, of course. She asked questions I could not answer. She looked at the photographs of her mother as a young bride and said she did not recognize the woman in them. But she also said something that has stayed with me ever since. She said, "All those years I thought she was just anxious. I thought she was paranoid about nothing. But she was protecting us. She was carrying all of this so we would never have to. We decided together to keep the secret within our immediate family. There was no point in telling my aunts and uncles, no reason to shatter their image of Grandma Eloise when she had worked so hard to build it. The Moranos were gone. Vincent was gone. The only person left who had been afraid was gone too. We let the fear die with her, the way she had hoped it would. I still have the shoebox. It sits on the top shelf of my closet now, behind a stack of old yearbooks and photo albums from college. Sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I take it down and look through its contents again. I study the photographs of my grandmother as a young woman, trying to find some trace of the fear that would come to define her life. But all I see is hope. She looks so impossibly young in those pictures, so full of the belief that love can conquer anything. She did not know yet what Vincent was, or what he would bring into her life. She did not know that she would spend the next 6 decades checking locks and watching cars and flinching at unexpected knocks on the door. I think about her often now, not the grandmother I knew with her lemon cake and her lavender hand cream, but the frightened young woman who reinvented herself completely just to survive. She built a whole life out of silence and secrets, and she did it so well that none of us ever suspected a thing. I do not know if that makes her brave or tragic or both, but I know this: she loved us enough to carry this burden alone, and she was strong enough to never let it break her. That is the woman I choose to remember. That is the grandmother I will always love. A cream-colored envelope changed everything, though I did not know it yet when I pulled it from the mailbox 5 days after we buried Dad. March 2017 had been the worst month of my life up to that point. My father died of a heart attack in his recliner, alone in the Rochester apartment where he raised my sister and me after our mother walked out. I was 24, working at a small accounting firm downtown, and my sister Tessa had just turned 22, still finishing her nursing degree while pulling night shifts at an assisted living facility. We were broke, grieving, and completely unprepared to handle the logistics of death. Dad never talked about what he wanted for a funeral, never talked about money, never talked about anything personal really. His past was the one subject guaranteed to make him leave the room. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, none of them existed as far as we knew. He raised us like he had appeared from nowhere, a man without a history, and we stopped asking questions years ago because the silence that followed hurt too much. The letter inside that envelope came from Scottsdale, Arizona, written in elegant cursive on thick stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. A woman named Lorraine Prescott claimed to be our grandmother, our father's mother, someone whose existence he had hidden from us our entire lives. She wrote that she and her husband Donald had been searching for us for years, that our father cut off all contact when he left home decades ago, and they never understood why. She found out about his death through an obituary search online, and her letter overflowed with grief and regret and desperate hope. At the bottom, she included a phone number and a photograph of 2 silver-haired people standing in front of a beautiful Adobe-style house surrounded by desert flowers. I remember holding that photo in the dim kitchen light, boxes stacked around me, searching their faces for something familiar. The woman had Dad's jaw, that same stubborn set to it. The man had his forehead, broad and lined. Tessa came up behind me and looked at the picture without saying anything for a long time. We had family out there, real family, and they wanted to know us. Tessa was the one who called them first. She always had more courage than me, more willingness to take risks, and I think the grief made her hungry for connection in a way I did not fully understand at the time. Lorraine answered on the second ring and immediately started crying, this soft, broken sound that made my sister tear up too. They talked for almost an hour that first night, while I sat on the couch pretending to sort through old bills, listening to Tessa describe our childhood, our father, the life we had lived without knowing they existed. Lorraine sounded warm and gentle, asking questions about our jobs, our health, our dreams for the future. She kept saying how much we sounded like our father, how happy she was to finally hear our voices. By the time Tessa hung up, she was convinced these were good people who had been wronged by a son who refused to forgive whatever happened between them. I wanted to believe it too. We were orphans now, both parents gone, and the idea of grandparents felt like a life raft in the middle of a dark ocean. Over the following weeks, the phone calls became a regular occurrence, sometimes with Lorraine, sometimes with Donald, occasionally with both of them on speakerphone. They asked about everything, our favorite foods, our allergies, whether we had any health problems growing up. Lorraine mentioned that heart disease ran in the family and urged us to get checkups, said she worried about us now that our father was gone. Donald talked about his own health struggles, a kidney condition that required dialysis 3 times a week, and how grateful he was for modern medicine. They offered to help with our father's remaining debts, sent a check for $5,000 that arrived in a padded envelope with another handwritten note. We deposited it feeling guilty and relieved at the same time. When they invited us to visit them in Arizona for a week, all expenses paid, Tessa accepted before I could even think of a reason to hesitate. Part of me felt uneasy, a small voice asking why Dad had cut these people off so completely, but I pushed it down. I told myself he was just a difficult man who held grudges. I told myself we deserved this chance at having a family again. We flew into Phoenix on a Friday afternoon in late April, and Donald picked us up at the airport in a silver Mercedes that still had that new car smell. He was thinner than he looked in the photograph, his skin carrying a grayish tint that I now recognize as the pallor of someone whose kidneys are failing. But his handshake was firm and his smile seemed genuine, crinkling the corners of his pale blue eyes as he loaded our bags into the trunk. Lorraine was waiting at the house with a spread of food that could have fed 10 people. Homemade lasagna and fresh bread, and a chocolate cake she said was our father's favorite when he was a boy. Their home was even more beautiful than the picture suggested, all terracotta tiles and high ceilings and windows that looked out onto the desert mountains. They had prepared a guest room for each of us, decorated with fresh flowers and soft towels and little baskets of toiletries. Everything felt too perfect, like a movie set designed to make us feel welcome, but I chalked it up to wealth and eagerness. These people had money and they wanted to impress the grandchildren they had never met. The first 2 days were wonderful, or at least they seemed that way on the surface. Lorraine took us shopping and bought Tessa a turquoise necklace that cost more than my monthly rent. Donald showed us his vintage car collection in the garage, 5 gleaming vehicles that he polished himself every Sunday morning. They told us stories about our father as a child, how he loved baseball and hated vegetables, how he used to build model airplanes in his room for hours. I learned that he had a dog named Chester who died when he was 12, and that he cried for a week straight. These details made me ache for the man I had lost, and also made me angry at him for keeping this from us. On the second night, Donald mentioned casually that he had scheduled us appointments at his personal physician's office for Monday morning. Just routine checkups, he said, since we were in town and it was important to know our family medical history. He would cover the cost, of course. Lorraine nodded and added that the doctor could run some blood work, check our kidney function and liver health, make sure we were in good shape. Tessa thanked them without hesitation. I said nothing, but something cold settled into my chest that I could not name. Monday morning came, and Donald drove us to a medical complex on the east side of Scottsdale, a sleek building with tinted windows and a lobby that looked more like a luxury hotel than a clinic. The physician, a tall man named Dr. Ashford with a silver goatee and an expensive watch, greeted Donald like an old friend. They shook hands and exchanged small talk about golf, while Tessa and I sat in the waiting room filling out paperwork. The forms asked detailed questions about our medical history, surgeries, medications, family illnesses going back 3 generations. There was an entire section about organ donation preferences, and whether we had ever been tested for tissue compatibility. I stared at those words for a long time, my pen hovering above the page. When I asked the receptionist why they needed this information for a routine checkup, she smiled and said it was standard procedure, nothing to worry about. Dr. Ashford called us back one at a time. He examined me thoroughly, more thoroughly than any doctor ever had, checking my blood pressure, listening to my heart, pressing on my abdomen with cold fingers. He drew 6 vials of blood and asked me to provide a urine sample. Before I left, he mentioned that he wanted to schedule an ultrasound of my kidneys for later in the week, just to establish a baseline for future reference. I found Tessa in the waiting room looking pale and quiet, her arm wrapped in a bandage from her own blood draw. She said Dr. Ashford had asked her strange questions, things like whether she smoked or drank heavily, whether she had ever had hepatitis, whether she would consider being a living donor someday if a family member needed help. She laughed when she told me, said he was probably just being thorough, but her laugh sounded hollow. On the drive back to the house, Donald talked about how important family was, how blood relatives had a responsibility to take care of each other, how his own brother had saved his life years ago by donating bone marrow when Donald had leukemia. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat nodding along, occasionally glancing back at us with an expression I could not read. That night I lay awake in my guest room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, replaying every conversation we had since that first letter arrived, the questions about our health, the insistence on checkups, Donald's kidney disease, The forms asking about tissue compatibility. A picture was forming in my mind, ugly and impossible, and I wanted desperately to be wrong. The next morning I woke up early before anyone else in the house was stirring, and I did something I am not proud of. I went into Donald's study, a wood-paneled room at the end of the hallway that he had shown us briefly on our first day, and I searched through his desk. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of financial documents and old photographs, I found a folder labeled with our names. Inside were printed copies of our social media profiles, screenshots of posts going back years, a timeline of our lives pieced together from public information. There were notes in Lorraine's handwriting about our jobs, our addresses, our relationship statuses. And there was a letter from a transplant center in Phoenix, dated 2 months before our father died, informing Donald that he had been moved up the kidney transplant waiting list, but that a living donor would significantly improve his chances and reduce wait time. A highlighted section noted that first-degree relatives, particularly younger, healthy adults, were ideal candidates. My hands went numb. I could not feel my fingers as I placed everything back exactly where I found it. I spent the rest of that day pretending nothing had changed, smiling at breakfast, nodding along to Lorraine's stories about her garden club, watching Donald with new eyes as he moved slowly through the house. Every kind gesture now looked like manipulation. Every warm word sounded like a transaction. That afternoon, Lorraine suggested we all look through old family photo albums together, and I sat on the couch between her and Tessa while she turned page after page of faded pictures. There was our father as a baby, as a toddler, as a gap-toothed child squinting into the sun, and then around age 15 the photos stopped. Lorraine's voice got tight when she reached those empty pages. She said our father changed when he was a teenager, became distant and angry, and one day he simply left and never came back. I asked her why, what happened, and she exchanged a glance with Donald that lasted half a second too long. She said she never understood it, that some children just reject their parents for no reason. But I saw something flicker behind her eyes, a shadow of something she was not telling us. That night, while Tessa was in the shower, I pulled her into my room and told her everything I had found. She stared at me like I had lost my mind. Then slowly, horribly, her face crumpled as she realized I was telling the truth. We left the next morning. I told Lorraine that Tessa had gotten a call from work, some emergency at the nursing home that required her to come back early, and we needed to catch the first flight out. Lorraine's face did something complicated when I said it. A flash of panic quickly smoothed into concern. She insisted on driving us to the airport herself, said Donald was not feeling well enough for the trip. The ride was excruciating. 40 minutes of small talk and strained silences while my sister gripped my hand so tight I thought she might break my fingers. At the terminal, Lorraine hugged us both and told us she loved us, that she hoped we would come back soon. That family was the most important thing in the world. Her perfume smelled like lavender, the same scent from that first letter, and it made my stomach turn. As we walked through the sliding doors into the airport, I glanced back and saw her standing by the car, watching us with an expression that haunts me still. It was not sadness or disappointment. It was calculation, the look of someone already planning their next move. We did not speak until we were past security, and then Tessa started crying and could not stop for the entire flight home. We never went back to Arizona. We never answered another phone call from that Scottsdale number. Lorraine sent letters for months afterward, each one more desperate than the last, talking about how much they missed us, how Donald's health was declining, how they just wanted to help and be part of our lives. One letter mentioned that Dr. Ashford had called with our test results and wanted to discuss them with us urgently. Another included a check for $10,000 and a note saying it was an early inheritance, no strings attached. We tore up the checks and burned the letters in the backyard of our father's old apartment, watching the paper curl and blacken in a metal trash can. Tessa and I talk about it sometimes, late at night when neither of us can sleep, trying to understand what kind of people would hunt down their estranged grandchildren to harvest their organs. We think about our father, 15 years old, somehow discovering what his parents were capable of, and running as far as he could. We understand now why he never talked about his past, why he raised us like a man with no history. He was protecting us the only way he knew how. I still wonder if Donald ever got his kidney, if some other desperate relative or stranger saved his life. I wonder if Lorraine is still out there, searching obituaries for other family members, other potential donors. Some nights I dream about that house in the desert, those terracotta tiles and high ceilings, and I wake up feeling like I escaped something I will never fully understand. My father saved us twice, once by running away and once by dying before they could reach us through him. I wish I could thank him for that. I wish I could tell him I finally understand. Nobody in my family wanted to deal with Grandpa Warren's house after the funeral, so the job fell on me. I was 34, recently divorced, sleeping on my buddy's couch in Harrisburg, and technically unemployed, which apparently made me the perfect candidate. The old man had lived alone in that place in rural Pennsylvania for over 40 years, collecting everything he ever touched, and the house needed to be cleared before the estate sale in April. I drove out there on a Friday morning in March 2023, expecting maybe 2 weeks of work. The house smelled exactly like I remembered from childhood visits, that mix of old wood, mothballs, and something faintly metallic that I always associated with the basement. Same floral wallpaper in the kitchen, same grandfather clock in the hallway that had been stuck at 3:47 for as long as I could remember. Started upstairs with the easy stuff, clothes and books and old photo albums, but I knew the basement was going to be the real nightmare. Everyone in the family knew about that basement. Grandpa had been shoving things down there since the early 80s. I spent the first 2 days just creating walkways through the mess, broken furniture, dead appliances, towers of magazines and newspapers that reached the ceiling in some spots. My aunt had warned me it would be bad, but she had no idea. By Wednesday afternoon, I finally made it to the far end of the basement, past the ancient furnace that groaned every time the heat kicked on. That is when I noticed something strange. A section of the back wall, maybe 6 feet wide, was completely blocked off by a heavy canvas tarp and a stack of wooden crates. When I dragged the crates aside, there was a door behind them. Not a regular interior door, but a thick metal one, like something you would see on a storage unit, with a heavy padlock holding it shut. The lock was old but solid, no rust on it at all, which meant someone had been maintaining it. I went upstairs and searched through Grandpa's desk for almost an hour before I found a small brass key in an envelope. The envelope just said, "Storage," in his careful handwriting. I remember my palms were damp when I fitted the key into that lock. I figured it was probably valuables, maybe some antiques or cash he did not trust the banks with. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. The door swung open easier than I expected, and the smell hit me first. Not rot or mold, but something clinical, like rubbing alcohol mixed with old paper. I used my phone flashlight to find a pull chain, and when the bare bulb flickered on, I saw a room about the size of a single-car garage. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, the industrial kind you see in warehouses, and every shelf was packed with boxes. Cardboard file boxes, the type you buy at office supply stores, each one with a white label on the front. The labels had dates on them. That was the first thing I noticed. Dates going back decades: 1987, 1991, 1994, 2003, 2011. They were not in order, just scattered across the shelves, but there had to be at least 30 or 40 boxes in there. In the center of the room was a wooden desk with an old lamp on it, the kind with the green glass shade, and a chair that looked like it had been sat in thousands of times. The seat cushion was worn down to almost nothing. I stood in that doorway for a long time, just trying to understand what I was looking at. My first thought was that Grandpa had been running some kind of side business, maybe tax stuff, or legal documents for people in town. That would have made sense. That would have been fine. I pulled down the first box I could reach, the one labeled 1994, and set it on the desk. Inside were file folders, maybe a dozen of them, each one thick with papers. I opened the first folder and found newspaper clippings. They were yellow and brittle, carefully cut out and preserved in plastic sleeves. The headlines made my throat tighten. Woman found dead near creek, no suspects. Police baffled by brutal slaying in Westmoreland County. Body discovered in wooded area. Investigation ongoing. Every clipping was about a murder. Unsolved murders. I flipped through the folder, and there had to be 15 or 20 articles in there. All from different newspapers, all from 1994, all about killings that were never solved. At the bottom of the folder, underneath all the clippings, there was a small Ziploc bag. Inside the bag was a silver bracelet with a charm on it, a little heart with the letter M engraved on it. I just stared at it. My brain was trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe Grandpa had been interested in true crime, like those people who follow cold cases as a hobby. Maybe he collected this stuff because he wanted to help somehow. But that bracelet, that was not a newspaper clipping, that was something real, something someone had worn on their wrist. I opened another folder from the same box, more clippings, more unsolved cases, and another Ziploc bag at the bottom. This one had a keychain in it, one of those cheap plastic ones with a photo holder. The photo inside showed a young woman with dark hair smiling at the camera. She looked like she was at a party or a barbecue, holding a red cup. I set it down and opened the next folder. A man's watch, silver band, stopped at 2:17. The next folder had a single earring, gold with a small green stone. Every single folder had something like this at the bottom. Personal items, things that belonged to people. I could feel my heart pounding so hard it was making my vision pulse. I pulled down another box, this one from 2003, and it was the same thing. Clippings about murders in different counties across Pennsylvania, sometimes from Ohio or West Virginia, and always those little bags with items inside. A wedding ring, a hair clip, a set of keys. I counted 8 boxes before I had to stop and sit down in that old chair. The seat was so worn that I could feel the wooden frame underneath. I sat there trying to breathe, trying to think of any explanation that did not lead where my mind was going. That is when I noticed the drawer in the desk. It was locked, but the same brass key from the envelope upstairs fit it. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, all Polaroids. The old kind with the white border. The first one I picked up showed a crime scene. Yellow police tape, officers standing around, a shape on the ground covered by a white sheet. The photo had been taken from a distance from behind a tree line, like someone was watching from the woods. I flipped to the next one. Another crime scene, different location, same angle. Someone standing at the edge, observing, photographing. There were at least 50 Polaroids in that drawer, and every single one was a crime scene photo taken from outside the official perimeter. Some of them showed the bodies before they were covered. I recognized one of the locations from a newspaper clipping I had just looked at, a wooded area near a creek in Westmoreland County. The article said the body was found by a hiker on a Sunday morning in September 1994. The Polaroid showed the same spot, the same body, but from an angle the police photos never would have captured. Whoever took these pictures had been there. They had been watching. I do not know how long I sat in that room. An hour, maybe more. My phone had died at some point and I had not even noticed. I went upstairs to charge it and splash water on my face, and that is when I saw the calendar on the kitchen wall. Grandpa had kept the same kind of calendar for as long as I could remember. Those big ones with a square for each day where you write appointments. He had a whole stack of old ones in a kitchen drawer, going back years. I do not know what made me start looking through them. Maybe I already knew. Maybe I just needed to see it for myself. I pulled out the 1994 calendar and flipped to September. On the weekend before that woman was found near the creek, there was a note in Grandpa's handwriting. Fishing trip, back Monday. I grabbed the newspaper clipping from downstairs and checked the date. She was found on Sunday, September 18th. According to his calendar, Grandpa was on a fishing trip that whole weekend, left on Friday and came back Monday. I felt sick. I grabbed another calendar, 2003, and cross-referenced it with the clippings from that box. Every single time, every murder, there was a note about Grandpa being out of town, fishing trip, visit cousin in Erie, hardware convention in Pittsburgh, church retreat. I spent the next 3 hours going through every calendar I could find and matching them to the dates in those boxes. 17 years of calendars, and the pattern never broke. Not once. When there was a murder in the clippings, Grandpa was always gone that weekend. Always had some excuse written down in his neat handwriting. I started making a list on a piece of paper, 2 columns, one for the murder date and one for his alibi. By the time I got to the bottom of the page, I had 23 entries, 23 unsolved murders across 3 states, 23 weekends where my grandfather was supposedly fishing or visiting family or attending some event. I thought about calling the police right then. I had my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over the keypad, but I did not. I could not. This was the man who taught me how to ride a bike, the man who took me to baseball games and bought me ice cream and sat with me when I had nightmares. I needed more. I needed to be absolutely sure before I destroyed his memory, before I told my mother that her father was a monster. So I kept digging. At the bottom of the desk drawer, underneath all the Polaroids, there was a leather notebook. The cover was cracked and worn, like it had been handled 1,000 times. I opened it and found page after page of handwritten notes, all in Grandpa's careful script, dates, locations, names. Some entries were just a few lines. April 14th, 1991. Route 30, rest stop near Greensburg. Female, late 20s, brown hair, blue Toyota in the parking lot, alone. Other entries were longer, more detailed. Physical descriptions, habits, what time someone left work or went jogging or walked their dog. I realized I was looking at surveillance notes. He had been watching these people, studying them, learning their routines. The notebook went on for over 100 pages, and not every entry had a corresponding newspaper clipping. Some of them were just notes, just observations, people he had watched but never acted on, or maybe people whose bodies were never found. I thought I was going to throw up. I actually leaned over the desk expecting it to happen, but nothing came up. My body just shook. I had to put my head between my knees and focus on breathing until the room stopped spinning. When I finally looked up again, I noticed something I had missed before. On the wall behind the desk, partially hidden by one of the shelving units, there was a map. It was a large map of Pennsylvania and the surrounding states, pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. And there were marks on it. Red dots, dozens of them scattered across the region. Some had small dates written next to them in black ink. I recognized some of the locations from the newspaper clippings. Westmoreland County, a spot near the Ohio border, somewhere in the mountains up north. Every red dot was a place where someone had died. I stood there staring at that map for a long time, counting the dots. There were more dots than there were boxes on the shelves. A lot more. Some of the older dots, the ones from the 80s, had faded so much they were almost pink. He had been doing this for decades, maybe since before I was born, maybe since before my mother was born. I thought about every family dinner, every Christmas, every Thanksgiving where Grandpa sat at the head of the table and carved the turkey and told jokes that made everyone laugh. I thought about the way he used to call me champ and ruffle my hair, how he smelled like pipe tobacco and peppermint. This man, this monster, had been hiding in plain sight my entire life, and nobody had ever suspected a thing. I left that room and locked it behind me. I sat on the basement stairs for what felt like hours, just staring at the concrete floor, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to burn it all, drag those boxes outside, douse them in gasoline, and watch decades of horror turn to ash. Nobody would ever know. Grandpa would stay the kind old man in everyone's memory, and I would carry this secret until I died. But then I thought about those items in the Ziploc bags. The bracelet with the letter M, the keychain with the smiling woman, the wedding ring. Those belonged to real people. People who had families that never got answers, never got closure, spent years wondering what happened to their daughter or sister or wife. I could not take that from them. I could not let Grandpa win one more time. So I called the police. I sat on those basement stairs and dialed 911 and told the dispatcher that I had found something at my grandfather's house, something related to old crimes, and I needed someone to come look at it. The deputy who showed up probably thought I was crazy at first. Some guy rambling about boxes and murder clippings in a secret room. But then I showed him. I watched his face change as he opened those folders and saw the Polaroids and the map. He made some calls, and within 2 hours that house was full of state police and FBI agents. That was almost 2 years ago now. I am still not allowed to talk about the details of the investigation, but I can tell you what became public record. They matched items from those boxes to 14 unsolved murders across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. 14 families who finally learned what happened to their loved ones. The investigators told me there are probably more, cases from the 70s and early 80s where the evidence is too degraded to make a definitive connection. My mother stopped speaking to me after the story hit the news. She says I destroyed her father's memory for nothing, that I must have misunderstood what I found, that there has to be another explanation. There is not. I know what I saw in that room. I know what those calendars said. Some nights I still dream about that map on the wall, all those faded red dots spreading across 3 states like a disease. I think about the fact that he died peacefully in his sleep at 87 years old, surrounded by family, and never answered for any of it. I think about how I sat on his lap as a kid and he read me stories before bed. And I wonder how many other families out there have basements they have never looked in, with doors they have never opened, hiding secrets that would shatter everything they thought they knew. Hospital rooms have a particular silence that sits heavy in the air, different from any other kind of quiet I have ever experienced. I learned that during my years as a nurse at St. Catherine Memorial in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but nothing prepared me for how that silence would feel when it was my own grandmother lying in the bed. October 2017 was supposed to be a good month for me. I had just gotten engaged to my college sweetheart. We were planning a spring wedding, and life seemed to be falling into place the way everyone always promised it would. Then my mother called at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, her voice cracking, as she told me that Nana Ruth had collapsed in her kitchen, and the doctors were saying she might not have much time left. I drove 3 hours through rain so heavy I could barely see the road, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, praying to a God I was not sure I believed in anymore. By the time I arrived, she had already slipped into that halfway state between consciousness and whatever comes next, her eyes closed and her breathing shallow and labored. Nana Ruth was 87 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, she had seemed invincible to me. She still lived alone in the same farmhouse where she had raised my mother, still tended her vegetable garden every spring, still made her famous apple butter every fall, and sent jars of it to everyone in the family. I had graduated nursing school when I was 23, young and idealistic, convinced that understanding the mechanics of death would somehow make it easier to face. Sitting beside her bed that Wednesday, holding her hand while my parents took turns pacing the hallway and making phone calls, I realized how wrong I had been. Her skin felt like tissue paper, thin and dry and fragile in a way that made my throat tighten every time I looked at her. She had been mumbling in her sleep all morning, fragments of sentences that made no sense, names I did not recognize, what sounded like apologies directed at people who were not in the room. I thought it was just the medication, or the confusion that often comes at the end, until her fingers suddenly curled around mine with surprising strength and her eyes snapped open. She looked directly at me, and for a moment she was completely lucid, completely present, and completely terrified. She was not supposed to come home that night, Nana Ruth whispered, her voice dry and cracked like autumn leaves. I leaned closer, thinking I had misheard her, thinking maybe she was still caught in some dream from her past. But her eyes were locked onto mine with an intensity that made me want to pull away. I need to tell you, before I go, I need someone to know. Her grip on my hand tightened even more, her brittle fingernails pressing into my palm hard enough to leave marks. I glanced toward the door, wondering if I should call for my mother, but something in Nana Ruth's expression stopped me. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a weight for so long that her bones had bent around it. And now, at the very end, she was desperate to set it down. I told her it was okay, that she could tell me anything, that I was listening. I had no idea what I was agreeing to hear. She started talking in a voice so low I had to lean my ear close to her mouth, close enough to smell the staleness of her breath and the faint chemical scent of the medications dripping into her arm. She told me about a night in the summer of 1987, a night when she was still living in Waynesboro with my grandfather before he passed. She told me about her neighbor, a woman named Donna Whitmore, who lived in a small blue house at the end of Chestnut Road with her husband and 2 young children. Nana Ruth's voice trembled as she described Donna, a quiet woman with auburn hair, who always wore a silver cross around her neck and who brought over casseroles whenever someone in the neighborhood was sick. She was kind, Nana Ruth said, and something in the way she said it made my chest feel tight. She did not deserve what happened to her, none of it, and I let them blame the wrong person because I was too afraid to speak. I sat there frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs, watching tears leak from the corners of my grandmother's eyes and disappear into the pillow beneath her head. The story came out in fragments, like she was pulling pieces of glass from a wound that had never properly healed. That summer night in 1987, Donna Whitmore was supposed to be visiting her sister in Pittsburgh. Her husband, a man named Gene, had told everyone in the neighborhood that Donna would be gone for the whole weekend. He mentioned it at the hardware store, at the diner, to anyone who would listen. Nana Ruth said she remembered thinking it was strange how often he brought it up, like he wanted to make sure people knew the house would be empty, except for him and the kids. She was sitting on her porch that Friday evening, shelling peas into a metal bowl, when she saw someone walking up the path toward the Whitmore house. It was not Gene. It was a man she recognized from church, someone named Lloyd Becker, who worked at the lumber mill on the edge of town and who had been seen talking to Gene in hushed voices for weeks before that night. Lloyd was carrying something wrapped in a dark cloth, something long and heavy, and he walked with the kind of purpose that made Nana Ruth set down her bowl of peas and watch. She told me she almost called out to him, almost asked what he was doing there when Gene's wife was supposed to be away. But something stopped her, a feeling in her gut, a warning she could not name, a sense that she was seeing something she was not supposed to see. She watched Lloyd disappear around the back of the Whitmore house, and she told herself it was none of her business, that he was probably just there to help Gene with some project, that there was nothing wrong with a man visiting his friend on a Friday night. She went inside and made dinner for my grandfather, and she tried to forget about the way Lloyd had walked, the way his shoulders were hunched like he was bracing for something. It was almost midnight when she heard the screaming. Even 30 years later, lying in that hospital bed, Nana Ruth's face twisted when she described the sound. Raw, animalistic, the kind of scream that does not sound human because humans are not supposed to feel that much pain. The screaming stopped after a few minutes, and then there were sirens, and then the flashing lights of police cars lit up the whole street in red and blue. Donna Whitmore had come home early from Pittsburgh because her sister had gotten sick. She was not supposed to be there, but she was. The police ruled it a burglary gone wrong. Donna had walked in on an intruder, they said, someone who panicked and attacked her before fleeing into the night. Gene played the grieving husband so well that no one thought to look at him too closely. He wept at the funeral. He held his children. He accepted casseroles from the same neighbors who had received them from his dead wife. But there was a man who lived 2 streets over, a drifter named Terrence Gould, who had been in town for only a few months, doing odd jobs and sleeping in a room above the old feed store. Terrence had a record: petty theft, a bar fight that landed him 6 months in county jail, and he had no alibi for that Friday night because he had been drinking alone in his room. The police found a pawn ticket in his pocket for a silver necklace with a cross pendant, and that was enough. Terrence Gould was arrested, tried, and convicted of Donna Whitmore's murder within 8 months. He died in prison in 2003, still swearing he was innocent, still claiming he had bought that necklace from a man he met outside a bar and had no idea where it really came from. Nana Ruth's voice broke when she told me why she never said anything. Lloyd Becker was her brother. Her younger brother, the baby of the family, the one she had helped raise after their mother died when Lloyd was only 6 years old. She had watched him take his first steps, taught him to read, protected him from their father's temper when the old man came home drunk and looking for someone to hit. Lloyd was not a good man. She knew that, she had always known that, But he was her blood, and when the police came knocking on doors asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that night, she told them no. She said she had been inside all evening, that she had not looked out her window, that she had not seen Lloyd walking toward the Whitmore house with something heavy in his hands. She lied to protect the boy she had raised, and in doing so, she condemned an innocent man to die behind bars for a crime he did not commit. "I have carried it every day since," she whispered, her voice barely audible now, her grip on my hand weakening. "Every single day, and now I am going to meet my maker, and I do not know if he will forgive me. But I needed you to know. Someone had to know the truth." She died less than an hour later, slipping away so quietly that I almost missed it. One moment she was breathing, shallow and labored, and the next moment, she simply was not. I sat there holding her hand long after it went cold, unable to move, unable to process what she had told me. My mother came back into the room with 2 cups of coffee and found me like that, staring at Nana Ruth's face, tears streaming down my cheeks without me even realizing I was crying. I did not tell her what I had heard. I did not tell anyone. Part of me wanted to believe it was just the ramblings of a dying woman, the confusion of a brain shutting down, memories tangled with dreams and regrets that had no basis in reality. I held on to that hope through the funeral, through the burial in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church, where Nana Ruth had worshipped for 60 years, through the weeks that followed when I tried to return to my normal life and pretend that everything was fine. But I could not stop thinking about Donna Whitmore, about Terrence Gould, about a man named Lloyd Becker who walked toward a house with something heavy in his hands on a summer night 30 years ago. It was almost 3 weeks after the funeral when I finally broke down and searched for it online. I told myself I just wanted to prove that Nana Ruth had been confused, that there was no murder on Chestnut Road in Waynesboro in 1987, that the whole story was a fiction her dying brain had constructed from fragments of old television shows and half-remembered news reports. I typed in Donna Whitmore Waynesboro 1987 and hit enter, and the first result made me feel like all the air had been sucked out of the room. There she was, a newspaper photograph from the Waynesboro Herald, grainy and faded, but unmistakably real. Auburn hair, a gentle smile, a small silver cross visible at her throat. The headline read, "Local Woman Slain in Home Invasion," and the date was July 18, 1987. I scrolled through article after article, my hands trembling against the keyboard, reading about the investigation, the arrest, the trial, the conviction. Terrence Gould's mugshot stared back at me from the screen, a thin man with hollow eyes and a look of bewildered terror, like he could not understand what was happening to him. And then I found something that made me stop breathing entirely. A small article from just 2 months earlier, buried in the local news section of the Waynesboro paper. The headline read, "Cold Case Review, 1987. Whitmore Murder Reopened After New Evidence Surfaces." I read that article so many times that I could recite it from memory. A detective named Hank Ellsworth had been assigned to review old cases as part of a state initiative, and when he pulled the Whitmore file, he found inconsistencies that the original investigators had overlooked. The pawn ticket that convicted Terrence Gould had been dated July 19th, 1 day after the murder. But the pawnshop owner's records showed he had not opened until noon that day, and witnesses placed Terrence passed out drunk in his room above the feed store until well past 2 in the afternoon. There was no way he could have pawned that necklace in the window of time the prosecution claimed. More troubling still, Detective Ellsworth had found notes in the original case file suggesting that another neighbor had mentioned seeing someone near the Whitmore house that night, a man who did not match Terrence Gould's description at all. That lead was never followed up. The neighbor who made the statement had died in 1994, but her name was still there in the file, written in faded blue ink on a yellowed piece of paper. Her name was Ruth Becker, my grandmother. She had told the police something after all, something that contradicted her later testimony, and someone had buried it. I spent the next week barely sleeping, barely eating, reading everything I could find about the case and about the people involved. Gene Whitmore had remarried in 1991 and moved to Florida, where he died of a heart attack in 2008. Lloyd Becker, my great-uncle, a man I had never met, whose name I had never even heard until Nana Ruth whispered it in that hospital room. had left Waynesboro shortly after the trial and spent the rest of his life drifting between small towns in the Midwest. He died alone in a motel room in Iowa in 2012. Liver failure, no family at the funeral. The only people still alive who might know the truth were Donna's 2 children, now grown adults with families of their own, and they had apparently been the ones pushing for the case to be reopened. I found an interview with the daughter, a woman named Catherine who was 6 years old when her mother was killed. She said she had spent her whole life believing Terrence Gould was the monster who destroyed her family, but now she was not so sure. She said she remembered things from that night, fragments that did not make sense, images of her father talking to a man in their backyard while her mother was supposed to be in Pittsburgh. She was too young to understand what she was seeing, but the memory never left her. I called Detective Ellsworth on a Monday morning in November, sitting in my car in the parking lot of the hospital where I worked because I could not bring myself to make that call from inside my apartment. My voice was shaking when I told him who I was and what I knew, and there was a long silence on the other end of the line before he asked me to come to the station and give a formal statement. I drove to Waynesboro that same afternoon, 3 hours through the same route I had taken to see my grandmother die, and I sat in a small gray room with fluorescent lights and told a stranger everything Nana Ruth had told me. I showed him the notes I had written in the days after her death, every detail I could remember, every name and every description. He listened without interrupting, his face completely unreadable, and when I finished he thanked me and said they would be in touch. I walked out of that station feeling hollowed out, like I had left something essential behind in that room. I had just destroyed my grandmother's memory, exposed her as someone who let an innocent man rot in prison to protect a killer. But I also knew that Terrence Gould deserved to have his name cleared, even if he was no longer alive to see it. His family deserved to know. Donna's children deserved to know. The truth does not stop mattering just because the people who lived it are gone. The case is still under investigation as of now. Detective Ellsworth told me last month that they are working on officially exonerating Terrence Gould, though these things take time, and the wheels of justice turn slowly, especially for a man who has been dead for over 15 years. I never told my mother what Nana Ruth confessed to me, and I do not know if I ever will. Some truths are too heavy to share with people who love the person being accused, and my mother worshipped her mother the way I once did. I think about Nana Ruth every day now, not the woman who made apple butter and taught me to bake pies, but the woman who sat on her porch and watched a man walk toward a murder and did nothing to stop it. I think about how she lived with that secret for 30 years, how she went to church every Sunday and prayed to a God she believed was watching, how she held that weight until it finally crushed her. I do not know if I can forgive her. I do not know if anyone can. But I know that she wanted the truth to come out, even if she was too afraid to be the one who told it. In the end, that was why she told me. She knew I would not be able to stay silent. She knew I would do what she never could. And maybe that was her way of making amends, passing the burden to someone strong enough to carry it into the light. I just wish she had done it 30 years sooner, before Terrence Gould died alone in a prison cell for a crime he did not commit, still waiting for someone to believe him. Grandma Evelyn called me on a Wednesday night, said she needed help going through some old boxes in the attic, and asked if I could come stay for the weekend. She sounded strange on the phone, her voice shaky in a way I had never heard before, and Grandpa Howard kept interrupting in the background saying something I could not make out. They lived on this 40-acre property in rural West Virginia, mostly forest and overgrown farmland, a place that had been in the family since before my mom was born. I had not visited since Thanksgiving 2 years prior, and guilt had been eating at me. So I told her yes, took Friday off work and made the 6-hour drive from Richmond. My friends thought it was sweet that I was helping my elderly grandparents. They had no idea what I was actually walking into. None of us did. If I had known, I would have stayed home and never answered that phone call. I would have let it ring until the voicemail picked up and then deleted it without listening. I pulled up to their property around 4 in the afternoon that Friday, the first week of April, when everything was still brown and dead from winter. The driveway was nearly a quarter-mile of gravel that had mostly turned to mud, and my car struggled through the deeper spots. Grandma was waiting on the porch when I got there, wrapped in a thick cardigan, even though it was not that cold, and she looked smaller than I remembered. Grandpa stayed inside watching some game show on the old television, barely acknowledged me when I walked through the door with my overnight bag. There was this tension in the house that I picked up on immediately, little looks between them when they thought I was not paying attention. Grandma would start to say something and then catch herself, change the subject to something mundane like the weather or what she was making for dinner. I figured they were just getting old, maybe having some health issues they did not want to worry me about. But it was more than that. Something was wrong in that house, something neither of them wanted to talk about. And I spent that whole first evening trying to figure out what it was. Saturday morning I woke up early, around 6, because I heard the back door slam shut. I looked out the window of the guest bedroom and saw Grandpa walking toward the tree line at the edge of their property, carrying a plastic grocery bag in one hand. He moved faster than I had seen him move in years, with purpose, like he had somewhere to be. I thought maybe he was going to feed some stray cats or check on something in the old barn, so I did not think much of it and went back to bed for another hour. When I came downstairs for breakfast, he was already back, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee like nothing had happened. Grandma made scrambled eggs and toast, and we talked about normal things, my job, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone. But I noticed the grocery bag was gone, and when I casually asked Grandpa what he had been doing outside so early, he just said he was checking the property line for fallen branches. Grandma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth for just a second, then she kept eating like everything was fine. That was the first real lie I caught them in, and it made me curious about what else they were hiding. After breakfast, Grandma asked if I wanted to take a walk around the property, get some fresh air before we started on the attic boxes. I said sure, thinking it might be nice to stretch my legs after the long drive. We walked past the old chicken coop that had not housed chickens in decades, past the collapsing barn with the rusted tractor inside, and toward the edge of the woods. Grandma pointed out different trees she remembered from her childhood, told me stories about playing in these woods when she was a girl. But I noticed she kept steering us away from a certain direction, always finding a reason to turn left instead of right, to circle back toward the house. At one point I saw what looked like a worn path cutting through the underbrush, heading deeper into the forest, and I asked her where it led. She got quiet for a moment, then said it was just an old hunting trail that did not go anywhere anymore. Her voice was tight when she said it, and she would not meet my eyes. That path was clearly still being used, the vegetation trampled down, fresh boot prints visible in the mud. Someone had walked that trail recently, and Grandma did not want me to know about it. That afternoon, while my grandparents were napping, I decided to follow the trail myself. I told myself I was just curious. Maybe there was an old shed or something interesting back there, nothing to worry about. I put on my hiking boots and headed into the woods, following the worn path through the trees. The forest was dense, mostly oak and pine, and the further I walked, the quieter everything got. No birds singing, no squirrels running through the branches, just my footsteps crunching on dead leaves. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened up into a small clearing, and that is when I saw the well. It was an old stone well, the kind you see in pictures from 100 years ago, with a wooden cover that had been placed over the top. The cover looked newer than the well itself, maybe only a few years old, and there were heavy rocks placed on top of it like someone wanted to make sure it stayed closed. But what really got my attention was the structure next to it, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked like an old root cellar or storm shelter, a concrete entrance built into a small hill with a rusted metal door that was slightly ajar. I should have turned around right there. Every instinct told me to go back to the house and pretend I never found this place. But I kept thinking about Grandpa sneaking out at dawn with that grocery bag, about Grandma steering me away from this direction, about all the strange looks and half-finished sentences. So I walked over to the shelter and pulled the door open wider. The hinges screamed with rust and a smell hit me immediately, damp earth and something else, something stale and human. I used my phone flashlight to look inside and my heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There were stairs leading down into darkness, maybe 8 or 10 concrete steps, and at the bottom I could see a small room. Someone had been living down there. There was a cot with blankets piled on it, empty water bottles scattered on the floor, canned food stacked against the wall, a bucket in the corner that I did not want to think about. And on the walls, written in what looked like marker or maybe charcoal, were words. Sentences. Please. I made myself go down those stairs even though every part of me wanted to run. And I started reading what was written on those concrete walls. The handwriting was messy, desperate. Some of it scratched so hard into the concrete that whoever wrote it must have broken the marker or charcoal more than once. The first thing I read was near the door, at eye level, and it said, "Please don't send me back, they will kill me." No punctuation, no capitals, just raw fear put into words. Further along the wall, there was more. "I did what you asked, I stayed quiet." And then, in bigger letters near the cot, "How long do I have to stay here?" There were tally marks scratched into one section of the wall, grouped in sets of 5, and I counted them twice to make sure. 117 days. Someone had been down here for almost 4 months, marking each day, waiting for something. The most recent writing was near the stairs, and it was different from the rest, calmer somehow, more resigned. It just said, "They are good people, they are trying to help me, I know that now." That one disturbed me more than all the desperate pleas combined. It sounded like something a person would write after they had given up, after they had accepted whatever was happening to them. I took pictures of everything with my phone, my hands trembling so badly that half of them came out blurry. I searched the rest of the shelter, looking for anything that might tell me who had been kept down here. Under the cot, I found a small pile of clothes, a worn flannel shirt and jeans that looked like they belonged to a man, maybe medium build. There was a paperback book with the cover torn off, some kind of thriller from what I could tell, with pages dog-eared throughout. In the corner behind the food cans, I found a wallet. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, and inside there was no money, no credit cards, just a West Virginia driver's license. The photo showed a man in his 30s, thin face, dark hair, tired eyes. The name on the license was Curtis Allen Webb, and according to the birth date, he would have been 34 when the license was issued. The issue date was 2015, which meant it had expired years ago. I stared at that face for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. Who was this man? Why had my grandparents been keeping him in an underground shelter on their property? And where was he now? The cot had not been slept in recently. The blankets were cold, and there was a layer of dust on everything. Whoever Curtis Webb was, he had not been down here for a while, but someone was still maintaining this place, still coming out here. The grocery bag Grandpa had carried that morning had to be connected somehow. I put the wallet in my pocket and climbed back up those stairs, my legs shaking so bad I had to grip the railing to keep from falling. When I got outside, I looked at the well again, really looked at it this time. The wooden cover was thick, solid, built to hold weight. Those rocks on top were not decoration, they were there to keep something in or keep someone out. I walked over and tried to move one of the rocks, but it was heavier than it looked, maybe 40 or 50 pounds. I managed to slide it to the side, then another one until I could lift the edge of the wooden cover just enough to peer inside. The smell that came up was horrible, wet and rotten, like standing water mixed with decay. I shined my phone flashlight down into the darkness, but the well was deep, maybe 30 feet, and I could not see the bottom clearly. There was water down there, black and still, and something floating on the surface. It looked like fabric, maybe cloth, bunched up and waterlogged. I could not tell what it was, and I did not want to know. I dropped the cover back down, shoved the rocks into place, and walked back to the house as fast as I could without running. My grandparents were awake when I got back, sitting in the living room watching television like nothing in the world was wrong. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at these two people I had known my whole life, trying to reconcile the grandparents who had taught me to fish and baked me birthday cakes with whatever was happening in that underground shelter. Grandma looked up and smiled at me, asked if I had enjoyed my walk. I said yes, it was nice, and then I went upstairs to the guest room and locked the door. I sat on the bed and pulled out the wallet. stared at Curtis Webb's face on that expired license. I searched his name on my phone, but the signal out there was terrible, barely one bar and nothing would load. I tried different combinations: Curtis Webb, West Virginia, Curtis Webb missing person, Curtis Webb obituary. The pages just kept spinning, never loading, and eventually I gave up. I needed to confront my grandparents, but I had no idea how to even start that conversation. "Hey Grandma, I found your underground bunker and the ID of the man you were keeping prisoner. Want to explain?" It sounded insane even in my own head, but I could not just pretend I had not seen what I saw. That shelter, those desperate words on the walls, the thing floating in the well. Something terrible had happened on this property, and my grandparents were at the center of it. I waited until dinner, sat across from them at the kitchen table while Grandma served meatloaf and mashed potatoes like it was any normal Saturday night. I could barely eat, just pushed the food around my plate, trying to find the right words. Finally, when Grandpa got up to refill his water glass, I pulled out the wallet and set it on the table. Grandma saw it first, and the color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. She grabbed the edge of the table with both hands, steadying herself, and whispered something I could not hear. Grandpa turned around, saw the wallet, and his whole body went rigid. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Grandma looked at me with these eyes I had never seen before, tired and scared and somehow relieved all at once. And she said they had been wondering when someone would find out. She said they had been carrying this for years, that it had been eating them alive, and maybe it was time to finally tell someone the truth. Grandpa sat back down heavily, like his legs could not hold him anymore, and he told me to put the wallet away because he could not stand to look at that face again. They told me Curtis Webb showed up at their door in the fall of 2015, desperate, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, begging them to hide him. He said people were after him, bad people, that he had seen something he should not have seen and now they wanted him dead. My grandparents did not know what to do. They were isolated out here, no close neighbors, and this terrified man was pleading for his life on their porch. So they let him stay in the old storm shelter, just for a few days until things calmed down. That was what they told themselves. But the days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Curtis was paranoid, would not let them call the police, said the people looking for him had connections everywhere. Grandma brought him food and water every day. Grandpa reinforced the shelter door, and they kept his secret. They told me he was a good man, just scared that he never hurt anyone and never asked for much. He wrote on the walls to keep himself sane, counting the days until it was safe to leave. But it was never safe, or at least that is what Curtis believed, and eventually something in him just broke. Grandma stopped talking at this point, could not continue, and Grandpa had to finish the story with tears running down his face. He told me that one morning in early 2016, after Curtis had been in the shelter for about 4 months, Grandma went to bring him breakfast and found the door wide open. Curtis was gone. His clothes were still there, the blankets, everything except the man himself. They searched the property for days, called out his name, checked every building and every corner of those 40 acres. Nothing. He had just vanished in the middle of the night without taking anything with him. Grandpa said they assumed he finally felt safe enough to leave, that he had slipped away to start over somewhere new. But then I asked about the well. The question came out of my mouth before I could stop it, and both of them went silent. Grandma started crying, these quiet sobs that shook her whole body, and Grandpa just stared at the table like he was looking through it into something terrible. He said they found the well cover moved a few weeks after Curtis disappeared. Said they looked inside and saw something floating in the water but could not bring themselves to go down there and check. They convinced themselves it was just old clothes, debris, anything but what they feared it might be. They put the cover back, weighed it down with rocks, and never spoke about it again. Not to each other, not to anyone, for almost 10 years. I left the next morning, barely said goodbye, drove those 6 hours back to Richmond with my head spinning. I never called the police. I know I should have, but these were my grandparents, 2 people in their 80s who had already lost their daughter and were clearly tormented by whatever happened to Curtis Webb. What would reporting it accomplish now? If Curtis was in that well, he had been dead for almost a decade. And my grandparents, they genuinely believed they were helping someone, hiding a scared man from people who wanted to hurt him. Were they wrong to do it? Probably. Did something go horribly wrong? Almost certainly. But I could not be the one to send them to prison for the last years of their lives. Grandpa passed away 8 months later, heart attack in his sleep. Grandma followed him 6 weeks after that, like she just gave up once he was gone. I inherited the property, all 40 acres of it, and I have not set foot on it since. The house is still standing, the shelter is still out there in the woods, and that well is still covered with those heavy rocks. I think about Curtis Webb sometimes, wonder who he really was, what he saw that made him so afraid, whether anyone ever came looking for him. I think about what might be floating in that black water, waiting to be found. But I am never going back there to check. Some answers are not worth knowing, and some secrets should stay buried exactly where they are. My grandmother waited until she was 83 years old to finally tell me the truth. I had driven down to Tucson to visit my grandparents, something I try to do every few months now that my grandfather's dementia has gotten worse. 15 years of producing television commercials in Los Angeles had taught me plenty about how this industry destroys people, and my graduating class from film school back in 2007 has mostly scattered to other careers by now. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what she told me that afternoon, sitting in her kitchen while my grandfather slept in the next room. She gripped my wrist with surprising strength and said she needed to tell me something before it was too late. Something about why they left the business in 1974, when both of them were on the verge of real success. I had always wondered why two people with genuine talent, my grandmother a session singer, and my grandfather a sought-after studio musician, had simply vanished from an industry they loved. The family story was always vague. Something about wanting a quieter life, about raising my mother away from the chaos of Los Angeles. But sitting there watching her face in the afternoon light, I could see she was about to unravel 50 years of carefully constructed silence. She started by asking if I remembered the name Clive Ashford. I told her I did not, and she nodded slowly, like she expected that answer. Clive Ashford, she explained, was a talent manager who operated out of a beautiful office on Wilshire Boulevard during the early 70s. He represented legitimate artists, some of them famous names I would recognize, and that legitimacy was exactly what made him so dangerous. My grandmother had been introduced to him through a mutual friend at a recording session in October of 1974. She was 26 years old, married to my grandfather for 3 years, and hungry for the kind of breakthrough that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Clive told her he had connections to a major label that was looking for fresh voices for a new project, something experimental that could launch careers overnight. He was charming, well-dressed, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had opened doors for dozens of artists before. My grandmother said she felt lucky, chosen even, when he invited her to a private audition at a studio in the Valley the following Saturday. My grandfather had a conflicting gig that day, a wedding reception in San Diego, so she would be going alone. That detail, she said, was not a coincidence. She understands that now. Clive had been watching them for weeks, learning their schedules, waiting for the right moment. The address Clive gave her led to an industrial area in Van Nuys, far from the polished studios she was used to. My grandmother told me she almost turned around when she saw the building, a squat concrete structure with no signage, surrounded by a chain-link fence and empty lots filled with dead weeds. But there were other cars in the parking lot, nice ones, a Cadillac and a Lincoln Continental, and she convinced herself that serious music people often worked in unglamorous spaces. She parked her Volkswagen Beetle and walked toward the entrance, where a young man in a suit was waiting with a clipboard. He checked her name, smiled warmly, and led her inside. The interior was surprisingly well appointed, with wood paneling, thick carpet, and framed gold records on the walls. She remembered feeling relieved, thinking she had misjudged the exterior. The young man brought her to a lounge area where 2 other women were already waiting, both around her age, both clearly singers or actresses based on their careful makeup and nervous energy. They exchanged polite introductions, first names only, and waited together on leather couches while soft jazz played from hidden speakers. After about 20 minutes, Clive appeared through a side door, wearing a burgundy blazer and rings on 3 fingers that caught the light when he gestured. He welcomed them effusively, calling each woman by name without checking any notes, complimenting specific details about their previous work that made it clear he had done his research. My grandmother said he had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, like he genuinely believed in your talent and wanted nothing more than to see you succeed. He explained that the audition would be a bit unconventional, that the label executives preferred to see how artists handled unexpected situations, how they thought on their feet. He asked them to follow him down a hallway to the main studio space. My grandmother remembers walking behind the other 2 women, noticing how thick the walls seemed, how the jazz music faded completely as they moved deeper into the building. When they reached a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor, Clive produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it with a theatrical flourish. He pushed it open and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. My grandmother was the last one through, and she heard the lock click shut behind her before she fully registered what she was seeing. The room was not a recording studio. It was a warehouse space, bare concrete floors and exposed pipes overhead, with industrial lighting that buzzed and flickered. In the center stood a long table covered with items that made no sense in context. Jewelry, watches, stacks of documents, a typewriter, several cameras, and what looked like bundles of cash wrapped in rubber bands. 3 men sat on folding chairs against the far wall, none of them dressed like music executives. They wore work clothes, denim and flannel, and they watched the women enter with expressions that my grandmother described as hungry, like they had been waiting a long time for this moment. Clive walked past the women toward the table, still smiling, still projecting that easy confidence. He picked up a manila folder and opened it, reading aloud from what appeared to be a script. He said they had been selected for a special opportunity, a chance to earn more money in one afternoon than most session singers made in a year. All they had to do was follow instructions. One of the other women, a blonde with a southern accent, asked what kind of instructions. Clive set down the folder and explained, in the same pleasant tone he might use to discuss recording schedules, that they would be driving to a location in Beverly Hills and retrieving certain items from a residence while the owners were away. My grandmother said the reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. This was not an audition. This was a recruitment, and they were being asked to commit burglary. The other 2 women reacted differently than she expected. The blonde went pale and started crying quietly. But the 3rd woman, a brunette who had introduced herself as Francine, seemed almost unsurprised, like she had suspected something was wrong from the beginning but had come anyway. Clive continued talking, explaining that the homeowners were out of the country, that the security system had already been disabled by an inside contact, that the whole job would take less than an hour. He emphasized that no one would get hurt, that the items they were taking were insured, that the victims were wealthy people who would barely notice the loss. He made it sound reasonable, almost victimless. Then he mentioned the compensation. $10,000 each in cash paid immediately upon completion. My grandmother told me that even in her fear, even knowing this was deeply wrong, some part of her brain did the math. $10,000 in 1974 was more than she and my grandfather earned in 6 months combined. She hated herself for even considering it, but that hesitation, those few seconds of temptation, bought her enough time to notice something important about the room they were standing in. There was a second door. It was partially hidden behind a stack of wooden pallets in the corner, painted the same gray as the walls, but she could see the outline of a frame and the glint of a handle. She did not look at it directly, did not want to draw attention, but she mapped its position in her mind while Clive kept talking. He was explaining the logistics now, how they would travel in separate vehicles, how they would enter through a service entrance at the back of the property, how each woman would be responsible for specific items on a list. One of the men against the wall stood up and walked toward them, holding 3 pairs of thin leather gloves. My grandmother accepted hers without making eye contact, feeling the soft material between her fingers, understanding that this was real, that these people had done this before, that they had a system. The blonde woman was openly sobbing now, saying she wanted to go home, that she had a daughter waiting for her. Clive's demeanor shifted for the first time. His smile remained, but something cold entered his voice when he told her that leaving was not an option, that they knew where she lived, where her daughter went to school, that cooperation was the only path forward. The room went silent except for the buzzing lights overhead. My grandmother felt her heart pounding so hard, she worried the men could see it through her blouse. Francine spoke up then, asking practical questions about the timeline, the target address, what kind of vehicle they would be using. My grandmother realized with a sickening clarity that Francine was going to go through with it, that she had already made her decision, perhaps before she even walked into this building. Clive seemed pleased by her cooperation and turned his attention to answering her questions in detail. While he was distracted, my grandmother took a small step backward, then another, positioning herself closer to the hidden door. She was not thinking clearly, operating on pure survival instinct, her body making decisions her conscious mind had not yet approved. The blonde woman suddenly collapsed onto the floor, hyperventilating, and both of the seated men rushed forward to help restrain her. In that moment of chaos, with everyone's attention on the crying woman, my grandmother moved. She crossed the distance to the pallets in 4 quick strides, found the door handle, and pulled. It was unlocked. She slipped through into darkness and ran without looking back, her heels clattering against concrete, her lungs burning, her mind completely blank except for one repeating thought: "Get out, get out, get out." The door led to a narrow corridor that smelled like motor oil and rust. Emergency exit signs glowed red at intervals along the ceiling, and she followed them blindly, stumbling twice on debris she could not see, tearing her stockings on something sharp. She could hear shouting behind her now, male voices echoing off the walls, but she did not slow down. The corridor ended at a metal fire door with a push bar, and she hit it at full speed, bursting out into blinding afternoon sunlight. She found herself in an alley behind the building, dumpsters overflowing with garbage, a stray dog watching her from beside a pile of cardboard boxes. Her Volkswagen was parked on the other side of the building, impossible to reach without being seen, so she made a decision in a fraction of a second and ran the opposite direction, toward the street. She kicked off her heels and sprinted barefoot on hot asphalt, not caring about the pain, not caring about anything except putting distance between herself and that gray concrete room. She reached a busy intersection and flagged down the first car she saw, a station wagon driven by an elderly woman who looked terrified by this barefoot, wild-eyed stranger pounding on her window. My grandmother begged her to drive, said she was being chased, said her life was in danger. The woman hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door. They drove in silence for several miles before my grandmother felt safe enough to speak. The woman, whose name she never learned, dropped her at a gas station in Burbank, where she called my grandfather from a payphone. She was crying so hard she could barely form words, and he left the wedding reception immediately, driving 90 miles an hour up the freeway to reach her. When he arrived, she told him everything, every detail, sitting in the front seat of his car in that gas station parking lot while the sun went down. My grandfather wanted to go to the police, but my grandmother refused. Clive knew her name, knew where she worked, probably knew where they lived. These were not amateurs running a small-time scam. This was organized, methodical, and clearly not the first time they had done this. She had seen the items on that table, dozens of stolen goods ready for distribution, and she had seen the look in those men's eyes when the blonde woman tried to refuse. Going to the police would mean giving statements, testifying, putting their names in official records that could be accessed by people with connections. She was convinced that cooperation with law enforcement would get them both killed. My grandfather argued with her for hours, but in the end, her fear won out. They went home that night and started packing. Within 2 weeks, they had sold everything they could not fit in their car and driven to Tucson, where my grandfather had a cousin willing to let them stay until they found their footing. They told everyone they were leaving for personal reasons, family obligations, a sick relative who needed care. They canceled recording sessions, broke contracts, burned bridges with producers and labels who had invested time and money in their careers. My grandmother said the hardest part was not the financial loss or the professional destruction, but the silence that followed. For years, she waited for a knock on the door, a threatening phone call, some sign that Clive and his people had tracked them down. It never came. She does not know what happened to the blonde woman or to Francine. She never saw any news reports about a burglary ring being dismantled, never heard the name Clive Ashford mentioned in connection with any criminal investigation. It was as if that afternoon in Van Nuys had been erased from history, existing only in her memory, a wound that never fully healed. She and my grandfather rebuilt their lives in Tucson, found regular jobs, raised my mother in quiet anonymity. They never spoke about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. My grandfather took the secret to his dementia, and my grandmother carried it alone for 50 years, until that afternoon in her kitchen, when she finally decided I was old enough and successful enough in the same industry that had nearly destroyed her to know the truth. I drove back to Los Angeles the next day with my head spinning. I spent weeks searching for any trace of Clive Ashford, combing through old newspaper archives, industry records, public databases. I found nothing definitive, just a few mentions of a talent manager by that name who had operated in the early 70s and then seemingly vanished around 1975. No criminal charges, no obituary, no forwarding address. I thought about hiring a private investigator, about digging deeper, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the look on my grandmother's face when she finished her story, the relief mixed with residual terror that had lived in her for half a century. Maybe it was the realization that some answers are not worth finding. My grandparents sacrificed everything to disappear, to protect themselves and their future family from people who operated in shadows. Reopening that door felt like a betrayal of everything they had endured. So I let it go. I visit them more often now, and sometimes when I sit with my grandmother while my grandfather sleeps, she will mention small details she forgot to include, fragments of that day that surface unexpectedly. She told me recently that she still remembers the song playing in the lounge when she arrived. A Carpenter's track, something soft and hopeful that she can never listen to again without feeling sick. She told me she sometimes dreams about Francine, wonders if she went through with the job, wonders if she is still alive somewhere living with her own version of this secret. I do not have answers for her. All I can do is listen and make sure she knows that her story, their story, will not die when she does. Some truths deserve to be remembered, even the ones that never made it into any official record. Late summer in 2024 found me staying at my grandmother Edith's house for a few nights, trying to help my mom manage things from a distance. Life had slowed down for me then. Freelance work, no strict schedule, and a lot of quiet hours that made the request feel manageable. Edith lived alone in a modest suburban home, the kind with narrow hallways and doors that never quite lined up right. Her dementia had been getting worse, especially after sunset, but during the day she could still hold a conversation and joke about old TV shows. I told myself this was just family duty, nothing dramatic. The first evening passed with mild confusion, repeated questions and a nervous habit of checking windows. Still, she recognized me, called me by name, and insisted on making tea she forgot to drink. I slept in the guest room, shoes by the bed, just in case she wandered. At that point, fear wasn't part of the equation yet. As daylight faded the next evening, her behavior shifted in a way I hadn't seen before. Edith stopped pacing and instead sat very still at the kitchen table, eyes sharp, listening to every sound in the house. Her voice dropped when she spoke, accusing me of touching her things, moving papers, opening drawers. She asked why I kept checking my phone and who I was reporting to. When I laughed it off, she slammed her hand on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. The warmth she carried earlier vanished, replaced by something guarded and confrontational. She followed me from room to room, keeping a careful distance, watching my hands. Every light switch I touched earned a comment. By the time I retreated to the bedroom, my chest felt tight with unease I couldn't explain. That night unfolded slowly, stretched thin by the silence of the house. The door to the guest room closed with a soft click that didn't sound like it came from my side. A moment later, metal scraped against metal, deliberate and controlled. Edith's voice came through the door, calm and steady, explaining that she needed to lock it from the outside. She said she couldn't risk letting it move freely once the house settled. I asked what she meant, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't escalate things. She told me I knew exactly what she meant and accused me of pretending. Her footsteps moved away, followed by the sound of another lock turning somewhere down the hall. Sleep never came. I sat on the bed, listening to the house breathe, counting every creak. Morning light spilled into the room through the blinds, ordinary and cruel in how normal it felt. The door opened easily when I tried it, though the frame was gouged with fresh scratches around the lock plate. The metal looked bent, stressed, as if someone had fought it from the outside. Edith stood in the kitchen humming, cheerful, asking why I looked so tired. She remembered nothing about the night, nothing about the locks, nothing about it. When I showed her the damage, she frowned like she'd never seen that door before. The house felt empty in a way I can't fully explain, like something had left quietly before dawn. I packed my bag before lunch, promising to come back soon, knowing I wouldn't sleep another night under that roof. Driving away didn't bring the relief I expected. The image of those scratches stayed vivid, looping in my head every time traffic slowed. By the afternoon, guilt crept in, heavy and persistent, so I returned the same day with groceries and a resolve to stay one more night. Edith greeted me warmly, apologetic for being difficult lately, though she couldn't explain what that meant. I inspected the doors again while she wasn't looking. The damaged locks were still there, deeper than I remembered, like grooves pressed with intent. I told myself stress had sharpened my imagination. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the hallway and she stopped smiling mid-sentence, eyes narrowing as if she'd heard a voice I couldn't. Dinner went untouched. She asked me to sit where she could see me. Once darkness settled, Edith's alertness returned sharper than before. She whispered instead of speaking, warning me not to move too fast, not to test her patience. Every few minutes she checked the hallway, pressing her ear to the wall, nodding as if listening to instructions. When I suggested calling my mom, her face hardened and she accused me of signaling. She blocked the kitchen doorway with a chair, explaining that pathways mattered at night. The house felt smaller with every adjustment she made, furniture dragged into odd positions, lamps unplugged. When I finally excused myself to the bedroom, she followed, standing just far enough away that I couldn't read her expression clearly. The door closed between us, and I waited for the sound I dreaded. This time the locks came quickly, firm clicks followed by the unmistakable scrape of force. Edith spoke through the door again, steady and patient, saying tonight was worse, that it was learning. She said she could hear it breathing near the vents, and that it copied footsteps when it moved. I asked her to unlock the door, trying to reason, but she only replied that love sometimes meant restraint. Something brushed the other side of the door, slow and deliberate, not heavy, but intentional enough to make my pulse race. The ceiling vent rattled once, then fell silent. I sat on the floor until my legs went numb, listening to her whisper instructions to someone who wasn't there. Morning arrived muted and gray. Edith slept in her chair, hands folded, peaceful. She laughed when I asked about the night, insisting she'd gone to bed early. The scratches on the lock were worse, curling outward like metal peeled back with fingernails. I took photos, called my mom, and arranged for in-home care that same day. When the caregiver arrived, Edith stood close to me, gripping my sleeve, quietly asking if I'd told them about it. I didn't answer. Leaving that house felt final this time, not rushed, just necessary. Whatever she believed she was protecting us from, I couldn't stay long enough to find out. I didn't go back after that day, but the house didn't leave my thoughts. Over the next week, the caregiver called twice to ask questions that made my chest tighten. She mentioned Edith insisting certain doors stay sealed after sunset, and refusing to sleep unless chairs were wedged under handles. One evening, the caregiver found Edith standing in the hallway, pressing her palm flat against a bedroom door, listening. When asked what she was doing, Edith said she was checking whether it had learned patience yet. The caregiver laughed it off at first, assuming it was part of the illness. Then she noticed the vents had been covered with towels, tightly packed, as if to block airflow. No one could explain how Edith had the strength to do that alone. A week later, a locksmith was brought in to replace the damaged hardware. He called me directly, sounding unsettled, asking what kind of force could cause that kind of wear from the outside. He said the grooves weren't consistent with tools, more like repeated pressure from something uneven. While he worked, Edith sat at the kitchen table, calm and polite, offering him candy she kept in her pocket. She told him not to worry, that it wouldn't try anything during the day. When he asked what she meant, she just smiled and said daylight made rules simpler. He finished faster than planned and refused to stay past dusk. That was the first time someone else reacted the way I had. The final incident happened less than a month later. The caregiver arrived one morning to find Edith locked inside her bedroom, door sealed from the outside, furniture dragged into place. Edith answered through the door, annoyed at being disturbed, explaining she'd done it herself to keep things contained. She was unharmed, lucid once the door was opened, and confused by everyone's concern. Adult services stepped in after that, and she was moved to a facility where nights were supervised and doors couldn't be locked manually. The house was sold not long after, emptied quickly, no questions asked. I never asked the new owners how the nights felt there. Some things don't need confirmation. I still think about the way she spoke, how calm she was when she said she couldn't let it roam. Dementia explains a lot, but it doesn't explain the damage or the way multiple people felt watched after dark in that house. Maybe she believed she was protecting us from something imaginary, or maybe fear gave her strength and purpose when her mind was failing. What I know is this: after she moved out, no more locks were scratched, no doors sealed themselves, and no one reported sounds in the vents. Whatever she thought she was keeping in check, it stopped the moment she left. And that's the part I don't try to rationalize anymore. People in this community usually understand why someone waits years before putting a story into words, and that's the case here too. I'm writing about something that happened during the last stretch of my childhood, in a quiet town where routines mattered more than questions. At the time, my days were split between school, a part-time job at a hardware store, and wandering the neighborhood with friends until the streetlights buzzed on. Life felt narrow but stable, the kind of rhythm you don't think will ever break. One person who fit into that rhythm was a girl named Kara, someone I'd known since elementary school. We lived 3 blocks apart, shared the same bus stop, and had the kind of friendship that didn't need constant talking. Her house always smelled faintly of boiled vegetables and old paper, a detail that stuck with me even then. None of us imagined how abruptly that familiar presence could vanish. Kara lived with her grandmother, a woman everyone called Mrs. Wilkes, who seemed ancient even back then. She moved slowly, spoke carefully, and kept her curtains drawn tight no matter the time of day. Over one summer, her behavior shifted in a way that adults whispered about but never explained to us. She began repeating herself mid-sentence, snapping over tiny things like shoes left by the door, or insisting the windows stay sealed even in the heat. Kara stopped staying out late and started leaving our hangouts early, always citing rules she couldn't bend. When I visited, I noticed notes taped to the fridge listing exact meal times and portions, written in shaky ink. The house felt tense, like it was holding its breath. Still, nobody called it dangerous, just sad or confusing. As months passed, Kara changed too, in subtler ways that were easy to miss if you weren't close. She started flinching when strangers walked past us on the sidewalk, tugging her sleeves down over her hands. She talked about food as if it were risky, refusing anything that hadn't been prepared a certain way. Sometimes she'd pause mid-conversation, listening for sounds no one else reacted to. When I asked what she heard, she'd shrug and change the subject. Her grandmother stopped answering the door altogether, and the mailbox filled until the metal door barely closed. Neighbors said they saw grocery deliveries left on the porch overnight. The house became a place people glanced at but avoided, Then, without warning or explanation, Kara disappeared. One day her bus seat was empty, and the next week the school office said she'd been withdrawn. Mrs. Wilkes' house went dark, the notes vanished from the windows, and a lock appeared on the outside of the gate. Adults gave rehearsed answers about family matters and told us to stop speculating. Years later, after I'd left town and built a life elsewhere, curiosity pulled me back into the story. Public records showed both Kara and her grandmother had been living in near isolation for a long time, following rigid schedules and strict rules driven by fear. Doctors later suggested untreated psychological illness, especially in the grandmother. What still unsettles me is how closely Kara's breakdown mirrored the routines she was taught, and how little anyone intervened before it was too late. After that brief look into the records, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been quietly buried. I started reaching out to people who'd known the family back then, framing it as nostalgia rather than concern. One former neighbor remembered the exact day things finally collapsed, describing it as unusually quiet, even for that street. According to her, Mrs. Wilkes had stopped allowing any noise in the house, including the radio or television. Kara had been pulled out of school weeks earlier and was rarely seen outside. That day, a delivery driver reportedly waited on the porch for nearly an hour, knocking softly, then louder, before leaving the bags untouched. No one saw movement behind the curtains. The silence bothered people more than shouting ever would have. I tracked down a retired social worker who had briefly reviewed the case years after the disappearance. She spoke carefully, choosing words like she was still being recorded. She explained that the grandmother had developed severe paranoia, centered around contamination and outside influence. Her routines weren't just habits but protective rituals, enforced with absolute authority. Kara's role shifted from child to participant, then to enforcer, mirroring behaviors that kept them safe. The records noted that Kara resisted at first, sneaking food or lingering at windows. Over time, those acts stopped. The social worker said this kind of psychological entanglement was rare but devastating, especially without intervention. What disturbed me most was learning how that final day unfolded. Emergency services were called by a neighbor after a smell raised concern, something sour and unmistakably wrong. Inside, they found Mrs. Wilkes unresponsive, her body already cold. Kara was still alive, sitting at the kitchen table, following the schedule taped to the wall. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening because the next mealtime hadn't arrived yet. She didn't cry or speak when help arrived, only asked whether the house would be sealed again afterward. The responders noted her calm as unsettling, like someone waiting for permission to exist. Kara was taken away that day and placed into long-term care, though details about where she went were limited. Her grandmother's death was ruled natural, but the circumstances raised concerns that never led to charges. The house was sold, cleaned, and repainted, erasing visible traces of what happened inside. Still, whenever I think back to that single day, it feels like a quiet ending to a long, invisible disaster. A child learned fear as routine, obedience as safety, and isolation as love. Even now, I wonder how different things might have been if someone had knocked harder, asked more questions, or refused to look away. What followed was a kind of quiet aftermath that didn't make headlines or inspire town meetings. Kara became a topic people referenced vaguely, as if details might summon something unpleasant back into the room. I learned she was evaluated extensively and diagnosed with severe anxiety shaped by prolonged psychological control. Professionals believed she could improve, but only with long-term care and strict boundaries separating her from the patterns she'd learned. The grandmother's influence was described as pervasive, not malicious in a simple sense, but consuming. Fear had structured every hour of that house. When authorities removed Kara, they also removed the framework she understood as survival. Recovery, I was told, meant rebuilding her sense of time, choice, and trust from the ground up. I drove past the old house once after learning all this, mostly out of a need to see it with my own eyes. The curtains were open now, and someone had planted flowers along the fence line. From the outside, it looked ordinary, almost inviting. Standing there, I tried to reconcile that image with the lists on the fridge, the locked gate, the silence stretching day after day. It struck me how easily suffering can blend into a neighborhood without triggering alarms. Nobody thought to question the rules inside that home, because they were labeled as personal, private, and therefore untouchable. That realization stayed with me longer than the story itself. I sometimes think about Kara sitting at that kitchen table, following instructions that no longer protected anyone. The image isn't dramatic, just deeply sad. A child trained to obey fear until it replaced instinct. Medical explanations help, but they don't erase the feeling that something human failed long before professionals were called. The systems designed to notice patterns didn't notice hers. Friends like me didn't recognize the warning signs for what they were. We accepted oddness as character, control as care, and silence as normal. Those small allowances accumulated into years of isolation. Sharing this now isn't about reopening wounds or assigning blame. It's about acknowledging how quietly damage can spread when routines harden into law and love becomes conditional. Kara survived, and that matters, even if her life took a path none of us imagined. The house moved on, the town moved on, and most people forgot. I didn't, and I probably never will. Some stories don't end with answers, only with the knowledge that attention, when delayed, can change everything. That's the part I carry with me, and the reason I finally wrote this down. Visiting my grandparents had always meant quiet afternoons and predictable routines, but this trip felt different from the moment I passed through the stone gates of their retirement community. They had moved there less than a year earlier, drawn by glossy brochures promising longevity, comfort, and next-level wellness. The place looked more like a luxury resort than a senior complex. All glass facades, manicured hedges, and staff dressed in spotless white uniforms. Everyone I saw walking the paths looked unsettlingly healthy, with straight posture, bright eyes, and skin that didn't match their age. It was impressive at first, almost comforting, like proof that my grandparents were in good hands. Still, something about the silence bothered me, the way conversations stopped when staff passed by. My grandfather, Harold, hugged me tightly but didn't linger, glancing toward the main building as if he were being timed. My grandmother, June, smiled a lot, but it felt rehearsed, like a habit she couldn't turn off. That first evening, I chalked it up to adjusting to a new environment and told myself I was overthinking things. Staying in their guest suite came with a stack of printed rules left neatly on the table, heavier than what you'd expect for a simple visit. Visiting hours were strict, meals were mandatory at assigned times, and certain hallways were clearly marked as off-limits. One rule stood out more than the rest, stating that guests were not permitted to interfere with any medical or wellness-related activities. I asked June about it casually, trying to sound curious instead of concerned. She deflected immediately, talking instead about how good the food was and how much better she slept now. Harold barely spoke, nodding along but keeping his eyes fixed on his plate. Later that night, I noticed security cameras in the hallways, far more than seemed reasonable for a place like this. Even the elevators required keycards, and residents were escorted during certain hours. It didn't feel like protection, it felt like supervision. The next morning, I followed my grandparents to what they called a wellness session, expecting something like physical therapy or yoga. Instead, they were separated at a set of double doors labeled with a clinical code instead of a name. Guests weren't allowed inside, so I waited nearby, pretending to scroll on my phone while listening. From behind the doors came low humming sounds, mechanical and steady, mixed with voices giving calm instructions. Residents went in relaxed and talkative, but when they came back out, their expressions were blank, their movements precise, almost synchronized. One woman passed me, her pupils oddly dilated, her smile fixed as if she'd forgotten why she was smiling. A staff member noticed me watching and gently repositioned himself between me and the doorway without saying a word. The message was clear enough without language. When my grandparents returned, they claimed everything was fine, but neither could explain what the procedure actually involved. As the day went on, Small details started piling up in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. I overheard two residents whispering near the garden, one asking the other how many cycles they had left. In the common lounge, a television looped promotional videos about vitality and extended lifespan, always cutting away before explaining how it was achieved. I noticed locked doors marked as medical storage, each with biometric scanners instead of simple locks. During lunch, June repeated the same story twice, word for word, unaware she'd already told it. Harold's hands rested perfectly still on the table, not even trembling when he lifted his glass. When I asked about friends they'd made there, they struggled to name anyone who had moved out or passed away. That was when it hit me that no one ever seemed to leave this place. Not really. That afternoon, curiosity pushed past politeness, and I took a longer walk alone through the community while my grandparents rested. Behind the main recreational wing, a service corridor branched off toward a low building with frosted windows and no signage. A faint antiseptic smell hung in the air, sharp enough to sting the nose. Two residents in identical robes waited on a bench nearby, wrists marked with thin, red impressions like tight bands had been removed recently. One of them noticed me looking and quietly warned me not to ask questions if I planned on enjoying my stay. Before I could respond, a staff member appeared and guided them inside, locking the door behind them with a keypad. The hallway lights dimmed slightly after they entered, as if conserving energy or hiding activity. Standing there alone, the place no longer felt luxurious, just controlled and carefully sealed. Dinner that evening was quieter than the night before, and the dining hall buzzed with an artificial cheer that felt forced. Conversations revolved around improvements, clearer thinking, stronger joints, better memory, all spoken in the same calm cadence. Harold mentioned a new treatment he'd been approved for, something that required a small contribution, though he couldn't explain what that meant. June squeezed his arm gently when he spoke, her eyes darting toward a nearby staff member before returning to her plate. Later, back in the suite, I pressed them harder than I had before, asking what they'd signed when they moved in. They admitted there were contracts, dense ones, outlining long-term care agreements and consent for experimental wellness programs. The word experimental sat between us, heavy and unresolved. Neither of them could say exactly what they'd agreed to in exchange for staying there. Night settled in, and sleep didn't come easily, so I listened to the building around me. Somewhere below, machinery ran in steady intervals, not loud enough to identify but persistent enough to notice. Footsteps echoed in the corridor at regular times, followed by soft knocks and doors opening without conversation. From my window, I could see a small group of residents being escorted across the courtyard, robes pulled tight, faces expressionless under the dim lights. No one resisted, no one questioned where they were going. A realization started forming, uncomfortable and slow, that this place thrived on compliance more than care. Longevity wasn't being offered freely. It was being traded for something unspoken. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, the idea that my grandparents were part of a system feeding on fear of aging refused to leave my mind. By morning, resolve replaced hesitation, and I confronted a staff supervisor in the lobby, asking directly what these procedures involved. The response was smooth and rehearsed, full of vague language about regenerative therapies and cognitive preservation. When I mentioned residents not remembering basic details or repeating themselves, her tone shifted just slightly, enough to notice. She reminded me that participation was voluntary and that extended life required commitment and sacrifice. That word again, sacrifice, echoed louder than anything else she said. When I returned to the suite, Harold and June were already dressed, ready for another session they hadn't told me about. They insisted I should enjoy the amenities while I could, speaking as if time there was limited for visitors like me. Watching them walk away with their assigned escort, the distance between suspicion and certainty finally closed. I couldn't let it end there, so I made one last attempt to reach them before leaving, catching Harold alone near the garden just before lunch. Up close, the changes were impossible to ignore, not dramatic but deeply wrong in subtle ways. His gaze lingered a second too long before recognizing me, and his voice carried a flat steadiness that didn't belong to him. He talked about how aging was a choice people made when they stopped investing in themselves, repeating phrases I'd heard in the promotional videos. When I asked if he was happy, he paused, searching for the word like it had slipped out of reach. June appeared beside him, guiding him away gently, thanking me for visiting with a politeness that felt practiced. Watching them walk off together, I understood they weren't just residents anymore. They were assets in a system built to harvest hope and obedience. Before leaving, I stopped by the front desk to formally check out, hoping someone might slip and say something real. Instead, I was handed a pamphlet about future enrollment opportunities and told visitors often reconsider once they see the benefits firsthand. The implication wasn't subtle, and it left a sour weight in my chest. As I waited for my ride beyond the gates, another group of new arrivals rolled in, laughing, impressed, carrying suitcases full of trust. The staff welcomed them warmly, already easing them into the rhythm of rules and reassurances. I wanted to warn them, to say something, anything, but every part of the place seemed designed to smother doubt before it could take root. Leaving felt less like a goodbye and more like an escape. Once home, I tried to convince myself that reporting the place would change something, but every attempt hit a wall of legality and consent forms. Everything had been signed, approved, sanitized by language that hid consequences behind promises. My grandparents stopped answering calls after a while, and when they did respond, their messages were short and oddly formal. They spoke about progress, clarity, commitment, words that sounded less like them each time. Months later, I received a letter informing me that visits were no longer recommended for the sake of their continued wellness. No explanation, just a polite closing statement and a signature from someone I'd never met. It felt like being quietly written out of their lives. What stays with me now isn't just fear, but the understanding of how easily people can be guided when the alternative is decline and loss. That community never needed chains or threats, only the promise of more time and the subtle erosion of choice. I still think about Harold's pause when I asked if he was happy, that brief gap where the truth almost surfaced. Whatever they're doing there works, at least on the surface, and that's the most disturbing part. The residents look alive, vibrant even, but something essential has been traded away. I don't know if my grandparents are still themselves anymore, only that they chose to stay, and the system made sure that choice became permanent.